Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. I hope you guys are doing all right this morning, this Thursday morning. November 21st? Man, we're getting close to Thanksgiving and almost into Christmas, and it is actually not that cold outside. It's super weird. I remember these are the days where it used to be freezing outside, but not so much these days. But either way, I hope you guys are doing great. I hope you guys are healthy, well, slept well, whatever you're doing and going about your day, or for that matter, if you're still laying in bed, as long as this voice is in your ear, I am deeply appreciative that you have cut your device on to hear me run my mouth about the stories of today, to do the news. I say it's the best damn morning show, news, politics, international and domestic, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. I'm glad you could join me for it. I have a damn good show for you today. It is packed to the gills, but it is a damn good show. Scott Ritter is going to be joining me at 7:15. At 8 o'clock, I have Eshan Safanajad. He is going to be going into the things that are taking place in Iran, because there are super interesting things around this notion of whether Iran is planning to attack. Up to this point, they're still saying they're going to do it. Will they? I don't know. He points out that there's a conflict in the government itself over this issue. So fair enough. At 8:30, we're going to have Ted Rawl. At 9 o'clock, we are going to get into, what was it? It'll come to me in a moment. But at 9:30, we have KJ No. So, like I said, full action-packed show. Oh, Netanyahu. Netanyahu is supposed to be in court on December 2nd, and he's been doing everything in his power to try to avoid going to court, including trying to get Shin Bet to give him an out for it. He apparently dislikes and wants to remove the guy that's head of Shin Bet because the guy wouldn't necessarily give him an excuse to stay out of that trial. There's that. There's also the IDF is apparently taking significant losses on the battlefield, even having somewhat of a lack of manpower. And on top of that, they are formalizing the annexation of the West Bank. This is according to Seymour Hersh. And this, according to Hersh, on his timeline, could take place within 2 weeks. The big story of today, though, is Russia asserts clarity. I call it clarity. If you remember, I pointed out yesterday that Russia has said very clearly, firing long-range strikes is a red line. And because he noted this is a red line, then you're stuck with that. And your credibility demands that you do something about that. Now, I pointed out over and over again that up to this point, the West had considered all notions of pragmatism by Putin as weakness, meaning Putin's attempts at trying to avoid a war were seen by the West as he's weak. He's not really in for it. We can continuously push and escalate, especially after Joe Biden loses or Kamala Harris loses the race and the American public effectively says, stop. We have no confidence in you. And not just no confidence in you, we trust the other guy on foreign policy more, the guy that says he wants to end wars as opposed to start wars, specifically this war. It was litigated in the race. Joe Biden knows, or at the very least believes, that this grift of hundreds of billions of US dollars pissed away on this geopolitical project to expand Western influence into Ukraine, and let's be honest, also to stick it to the Russians, the jig is up. At least they think so. And so they have started to escalate over the course of the next 2 months and the time that Joe Biden has remaining. I would imagine to try to ingratiate Ukraine further into NATO under this belief that Putin is bluffing. And I would imagine in their mind, if Putin doesn't respond, they would go further, and they would go further, and they would go further, up to potentially putting forces into Ukraine. So my point that I made yesterday was that any response by Russia has to be significant enough to get across. We are not joking. We are not playing with you. We are deadly serious. We changed the nuclear doctrine. That should have been a heads up. We are on nuclear alert, according to Colonel, oh, I can't think of his name. It'll come to me in a moment. And we have warned you that this is a no-go. Last night, they fulfilled the obligations that I put forth, and they launched an ICBM for the first time in this conflict. And he got across a few things. One, that Russia was fighting this with its arm tied behind his back. Because the fact of the matter is, they've been fighting this war in a very specific way without using all the elements of their power to fight this war. And the fact that the ICBM missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, is just now being launched, it's to make a point. This was Sergei Lavrov. The United States never actually came out to say that they changed policy. They just changed policy. And it was reported in the media. And then you get missiles fired by Ukraine almost immediately. And then you get Storm Shadow missiles fired immediately after. At which point I said, they are going to have to do something dramatic to get across their seriousness. And it can't be minor. It has to be clear. Lavrov came out and said this. Effectively, we're in a new stage of the war.
Decision of the United States to allow Ukrainian regime to use missiles up to 300 kilometers long. We read what the New York Times published about this. There are still no confirmation either from the White House or from the Pentagon, but we basically take our position on the basis of what is going on physically. And physically, ATACMS, apparently not as long as 300 kilometers, are being used, including this early morning in Russia, against the Bryansk Oblast of Russia, which is bordering Ukraine. And we proceed from the understanding that this is happening, and that any modification of ATACMS cannot be used without American experts and instructors, including satellite data, including programming and targeting. The president mentioned this several times. If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia.
A quantitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia. Last night, there were reports that an ICBM had been launched. And there were reports that effectively a missile barrage, but one ICBM. It looked like this, falling from the sky at obscene speeds. Now, what you're seeing are 6 of them landing. Now, the reason that there's 6 is because this particular warhead breaks out into 6 different warheads. From my understanding, this warhead could also carry nuclear weapons, meaning the ICBM didn't have to be used in this situation for them to accomplish the objective. They used it specifically to make the point, A, this can hit anywhere in Ukraine. B, this can hit anywhere in Europe. C, you can't stop it, meaning you can't do anything about it. When it's fired, it's going to hit its target. This is what it apparently looks like. right here. Avant-garde warheads, top speed 33,000 kilometers per hour. This particular one, it can have different types of warheads, so it doesn't necessarily have to have the breaking out into 6 warheads. It's just so happened that this is the type that breaks out. It can have multiple different warheads. In having multiple different warheads, one of those warheads, it could be many actually, but it's a nuclear capable missile. It's a nuclear capable missile. This specific one is called the RS-24 YARS. Up to 5,000 kilometers, again, depending upon the warhead that's being used. This specific one functions like this. Turns into multiple warheads. Those warheads can hit different targets within a certain radius of itself. Hence, that ends up screaming into Earth. Looking like this. Ukraine reported that this was being used. Now, the damage was done to an industrial area because, again, the entire point wasn't necessarily to destroy a lot of stuff. The point was the fact that it was being used for the first time in the war. That was the point. That was the objective. We are being serious. Do not screw with us. We will escalate further. Now, the catch becomes, are they going to get the message? Meaning, do they take this and say, yeah, Putin is still bluffing. We still don't believe him, which would necessitate a larger show of strength going forward than that ICBM. And look, man, they are trying to make this point clear. The wild part about it is Lavrov, in that statement, pointed out we are trying to avoid a nuclear war. And therein lies the rub. In order to avoid a nuclear war, you ironically must be willing to demonstrate that you would end the world. You have to be a sword holder. This kind of logic of, in order for me to prevent them from continuing to escalate, I need to escalate in a way and be forceful enough where they realize and recognize, okay, he will end the world. He will go to the mat. It is existential for him. And he's willing to go as far as necessary in order to demonstrate that it is existential for him, even to the point of ending the world. Test me. I know it sounds ironic. I know it sounds weird. But the reality of it is, if you are showing weakness in this particular moment, and weakness in this case is pragmatism, if you're showing that in this moment, they have only accepted pragmatism through a lens that you are weak, you are incapable, you are bluffing, you are unwilling to take the next step. Now, whether that's what they tell themselves, whether that's what they say in the open, I don't know. But for the most part, up to this point, they have been reckless and they have been willing to put the world at risk. Russia now has to demonstrate in a way that gets them to stop, or at the very least strongly incentivizes them to stop, with the safety of their own nations, their own people, in lieu, meaning hanging in the balance. That's what that was designed to do. First time being used. Didn't need to be used. They used it to make a point. Now, how far is the West continuing to go or willing to go? I guess we will see today. But up to this point, we are in a new phase of this war. That's what that means. Now, if you see a situation where they continue to escalate, I would imagine that Russia is also going to continue to escalate. I want to bring in my guests. We're joined with the one and only Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is the perfect person to talk to today. It's just so happened that you said yes, and just so happened this happened overnight. Scott, let me bring you in. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. How you doing this morning, Scott? You doing all right?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yourself?
I am doing okay, a bit freaked out and a bit concerned at the events that are taking place. Let's start at the beginning. I listened to your talk on the issue for Joe Biden, and I agree with you. I agree with you 1,000%. Up to this point, every action that Putin has taken that has been pragmatic has been accepted or seen through this lens of weakness. He's bluffing, he's weak, despite the fact that what they've been doing was trying to prevent a larger war. Joe Biden, on his way out, despite democratically failed, gets lame duck, and on his way out decides to escalate in a way that Putin has defined as being a red line. Why is Joe Biden doing this? Is it the innocent answer of, well, he's doing this for posterity, so in 1,000 years when they look back they can say, well, he did everything he could to keep Ukraine in the Western sphere of influence? Or is it the more cynical reason of, we are going to pull Ukraine as far into NATO, let's say, ideals and contexts in this next 2 months? Basically, we are going to accelerate this notion of ingratiating NATO or NATO tactics into Ukraine. What is it? Why is Joe Biden doing this now?
Well, first of all, I don't know if Joe Biden's doing anything now. He's clearly a diminished man. Whether or not he is capable of the cognitive processes required to make complex national security decision making is a legitimate question that everybody should be asking. What we do know is that there was a split in his administration about this very issue, whether or not to allow Ukraine to use U.S. provided ATACMS missiles to strike targets in Russia. We know that back in September, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin articulated very strongly against this policy, understanding that these weapons would not contribute to a Ukrainian victory. Ukraine was still going to lose this war. As Austin said, the only way out of this conflict is through negotiation, and also the recognition that by doing so, this could lead to an escalation, the consequences of which are unpredictable. Secretary of State Tony Blinken had a different approach. There was an approach that I think even in September, prior to the election, was premised on the fear of a Trump victory and the need for the United States to do something that protected NATO and Ukraine from a potential Trump administration. And what they needed to do is get NATO and Ukraine so closely entwined together, in effect, to make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO with NATO military presence on the soil, etc., that a Donald Trump administration would not be able to come in and mess that up. The idea was to Trump-proof NATO, Trump-proof Ukraine. In order to do that, you would have to implement policies that represented a radical departure from past practice, policies that are reflected in the Zelensky 10-point peace plan that he has put out there. The first measure of which is give us long-range weapons. The next thing he's going to ask for, if you give Ukraine long-range weapons and once again Russia does nothing, the next thing is to say, well, we're going to extend NATO air defense into Western Ukraine, allow Patriot missiles out of Poland to shoot down Russian missiles as they come in to Ukrainian territory. And then the next step would be to put NATO aircraft over Ukraine to engage Russian missiles and cruise missiles. This is what Zelensky is asking for. And then this inevitably leads to boots on the ground, a military presence. And now NATO is in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO. This is Trump proofing 101. It's also a recipe for disaster because it actually takes us down the path of meeting the conditions set by Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, up until now, the West, the Blinkens of the world are saying that Russia is bluffing, that Putin is bluffing, and that's why they can do this. I think today Putin showed that he's not bluffing. He warned that if you use these weapons, these ATACMS missiles, which even the Russians say, it doesn't change anything. Ukraine fired 6. 5 were shot down. 1 got hit in the air, broke up coming in, did some damage. That's not the point. The point is Russia understands the escalation that's taking place, that if you don't nip this in the bud now, the next thing you know, you have Poland saying they're going to extend their air defense. And now you have a bigger crisis. So the time to act is now, and that's what they've done. They've fired a missile, which under certain configurations could be classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile. Under other configurations is an intermediate range missile. But the bottom line is, for the first time in the history of war, I'll say it one more time, for the first time in the history of war, an ICBM has been fired in combat. And there's nothing the West can do. They can't stop it. They can't shoot it down. And it used a warhead. I think when the battle damage assessment comes in, the warhead type that was used, which we had not, I've been following this for a long time. Maybe people in the Pentagon who have access to the top secret information, had a clue that this was up. But most discussions had this missile, which is called the RS-26 Rubiège or Frontier. It wasn't RS-24. The Rubiège is actually the first 2 stages of the RS-24. The RS-24 is a 3-stage ICBM. The Rubiège uses the first 2 stages of it. We had thought it either has a nuclear warhead, or it could have 3 avant-garde, which was what you were showing there, the avant-garde hypersonic reentry vehicles. But nowhere have I read that it could have a conventional payload of up to 6 cassette-type warheads. That meaning, when I say that, each one of these 6 warheads has 6 submunitions in it. So there's 36 total, munitions striking the ground at very high speed with extreme accuracy, bringing a lot of damage in a very isolated place. This wasn't on my radar, and I don't know if it was on anybody's radar who didn't have access to, the most sensitive intelligence information in the United States. And I'm even wondering if the United States was aware that this warhead type was available for the Rubiège. The Russians did this, sending a signal that they can strike anywhere in Europe, anytime they want, with non-nuclear power that will destroy whatever target it's aimed at. There's no target safe from the Rubiège. The Russians just told the Poles, hey, you just activated that anti-ballistic missile site, the Mark 41 Aegis ashore. It's dead, and it's not going to require a nuclear weapon to do it. We'll just put a Rubiège on it, and it's do svidaniya. Putin has been warning about this for some time. I've been tracking this. Back in the summer, Putin appeared to restart the Rubiège production line in Votkhinsk. The Rubiège was developed in in 2015, scheduled to come online in 2017, but because it has the ability to be classified as either an intercontinental ballistic missile or an intermediate range missile, the Russians decided not to go forward because they would have to commit to a warhead type for this weapon under the terms of the START treaty, because the IDF treaty, which was still the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed in 1987, implemented in 88. I was an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty weapons inspector. In fact, the first one on the ground in the Soviet Union to implement this treaty. a very important treaty. And that treaty prohibited, missiles like the Rubiège that was fired the other day. But Donald Trump withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019. And the Russians said, we have no intention of, even though you withdrew from it, we're not going to build new INF type systems unless you deploy INF type systems to Europe. And unfortunately for the world, the United States did just that. We deployed intermediate range systems in a training exercise in Denmark. And the Russians said, okay. And they opened up the Rubiège production lines. This was sometime in July. Based upon my past experience there and such, the rate of production of a Rubiège, if brought into full-scale production, which the Russians were prepared to do, it's about 6 to 8 missiles a month. And in the time frame, that means they could have produced between 36 and 40 of these missiles. And they're still producing them. So Russia has a sufficient arsenal of these missiles right now ready to take out all of Europe without nuclear weapons, to destroy Kiev, to take out any target they want. They hadn't used these because this represents a qualitative advance in the war, and Russia was avoiding that. But Russia said, if you use these ATACMS missiles, if you use the Storm Shadow, the Scalp against Russian targets, that's a qualitative advancement, and we will respond. And they're not going to respond in kind. Russia just put down the biggest warning you have. This is the first time, I just want your audience to understand that an ICBM has been fired in combat in the history of the world. And the Russians just did it, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do to stop that weapon. And now they have a bunch of them, and it's game on. Will the West learn its lesson? Will the West back down and understand that you're not going to save Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost this war, and the best way out of this crisis is to get Ukraine to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring an end to this conflict? Or they can continue to deceive themselves into believing that they can push Russia to the point where Russia breaks, that Putin is bluffing. Today proved Putin's not bluffing. And I will tell you this, if we continue, the Rubiège will be used again and again and again to take out targets in Ukraine that will become increasingly painful for the Ukrainians and for us. And if we continue to push, then they will take out targets in Europe.
Well, that's the other catch. This is also capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, which is also the other, I would imagine, warning that is being issued. I mean, you get the changing of the nuclear guidelines or the nuclear policy, and then you get a missile, ICBM, first time ever fired, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead on top of that. I don't necessarily think those things are separate from one another. I don't think they're a coincidence. That has to be part of the message that is being sent using this weapon, correct?
Look, they just published. They published the idea of a modified, updated nuclear posture, nuclear employment doctrine.
Right.
Putin discussed that back in September when he met with his leadership. He just signed that into law on November 19th.
Right.
And he has said straight up, if you attack us with these missiles, we can use nuclear weapons against you. And of course, now the United States has in effect attacked Russia with these weapons. These weapons could not be fired without American assistance, American direction, American permission. So from the Russian perspective, the United States has attacked Russia. And so now they have fired a weapon system, which you're 100% correct, is fully capable of carrying between 1 and 3 nuclear warheads. And I think Russia's putting the marker down, saying, this time we use conventional. We're fully capable of using nuclear weapons on this too. And if you want to keep pushing the envelope, we just told you what the doctrine is. It shouldn't come as a surprise if we, in fact, nuke you.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Do you think after this demonstration, because my point of view the other day was that Russia is going to have to respond in a way that is significant enough to get across, we are serious and we are not messing around. Basically, it's almost like you have to be strong enough to get across that you're willing to end the world in order to get them to not continue to escalate. Otherwise, they take your weaknesses or your pragmatism as weakness. Do you think that they are going to, and I guess this kind of depends on what Joe Biden's objective is, or whoever's running the show objective is. Is their objective ultimately war? Or is it that they're pushing the envelope, seeing to how far they can push without going over the cliff, this kind of brinksmanship? Where do you think they are on this? Meaning, do you think they take this demonstration for the seriousness that it deserves? And if they don't, what would be the next escalation from your point of view?
Well, let's start, first of all, with why Russia did what it did. I mean, they've introduced a dramatic new weapon. The
Right.
target they hit is a missile factory. The former Yuzhmash missile factory used to produce Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Ukrainians renamed it, and they produce missile-related technology. Right now, Ukraine is saying that they're producing their own ballistic missiles to be used to strike Russia. Well, they ain't going to be producing them at the Yuzhmash factory anymore. Yuzhmash factory no longer exists because of what Russia just did. So, I mean, that was the signal that, look, we can do this. There had been hints that Russia would have used a weapon like that against Kiev, against Bankova Street, to take out the Ukrainian government, but they did not. Instead, they struck a legitimate military target, which is in keeping with Russia's approach so far, which is not to, turn this into a nation-killing exercise. But the next step will be to kill the Ukrainian government. And I think that's the message that needs to be played out here in the West, is that Russia just demonstrated the ability to take out the Ukrainian government using non-nuclear power. They did not do so because they're giving the West a chance to change its policy direction.
You're so right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say,
I hope the West hears this message. I know there will be a debate in NATO. Hopefully, those who say Russia's bluffing no longer will say that, but there will be some who will say, well, they didn't hit Kiev, though. They're scared. They hit Dnipropetrovsk. It's not the decisive step that they said. We still don't think that they'll follow through, and they may seek to escalate. But if they do that, what this has done is it built in an additional escalatory step that Russia can take before it has to attack Europe. But the next step will be to take out Kiev. And the next step after that will be to strike European targets. And then the next step after that is nuclear war. So we're literally 3 steps away from the world ending. Good morning, America.
Yeah. I mean, and people are talking about like Taylor Swift and all this other nonsense. And we are literally whistling past the graveyard. It also explains why the report came out saying that Kiev was going to be hit. I mean, because they shut down those embassies under this notion that Kiev is going to be hit. We close down our embassies. We don't want to take the chance of our employees being there. But if you're right, then the reason that they gave that heads up is you could be next. Effectively, this is what we hit, but we could have done that to Kiev if you keep pushing us. Wow. I guess my question is, where do you think the U.S. is going to fall on this? Do you think that they're going to end up saying, well, we think they're bluffing? We don't think they have it in them to hit Kiev? And do you think that some of these people actually want the war, meaning want to provoke in a way that tries to get them to go further than just hitting it in Ukraine? How far do you think some of these people are willing to go?
Well, let's put it this way. The Rubiège, the RS-26, is a road mobile system. It's designed to be fired from, a non-observed location in the woods. It's not supposed to be detected. There's an element of surprise to this. The Ukrainians knew that the RS-26 was about to be fired because the Russians took it to Kapustin Yar outside of Astrakhan. Kapustin Yar is a missile test facility, and they put it on display.
Right.
They They had it there, sitting there, oriented towards Ukraine, not towards the impact zone. So they brought the RS-26 out into the open, oriented it towards Ukraine for at least 24 to 48 hours, so that the West could A, see it, and B, get all of their intelligence collection capabilities brought to bear. Because when Russia's going to launch a missile of this notion, you don't just want, the IR signal and all that stuff. You're going to want all of the telemetry, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's done to collect on this. And Russia wanted the West to see this, to observe it, to learn from it. They wanted everything so that when the missile was fired, the West saw all of the operational parameters of the missile. They saw the stage separation. They saw the post-boost vehicle separation. They saw it maneuver. They saw it release. They did it. There's things that can happen in space that give us very close look at all this if, in fact, we deployed those systems. But my point is, Russia gave the American intelligence all of the opportunity in the world to collect every single piece of information they wanted. Why? Because Russia wants America to know what they're dealing with here. Russia, this wasn't a little sneak attack where Russia snuck in under the radar. They came out and said, boom, here we are. Boom, there it is. That's the direction we're firing. And bam, we did it. And I hope you collected everything, so that the Pentagon, the CIA comes to Lloyd Austin and says, yep, we can't stop it. And then Lloyd Austin gets to go to Tony Blinken and slap him across the face and say, we can't stop it. And then somebody gets to go to Joe Biden, inject him with some sort of caffeine supplement. So he wakes up and says, boss, we can't stop it. It's war. And hopefully at that point in time, Biden doesn't nod off to sleep and he goes, let's get off this stupidity. Blinken, you gambled. Russia's not bluffing. We're not playing this freaking game. Bring it to an end. Call up NATO and say, stop the nonsense. Starmer, stand down. Macron, stand down. We're not going to world war over this, or we all die. But the Russians are doing everything humanly possible to make sure that the United States had every opportunity to collect every piece of technical intelligence about this missile launch, so that there could be no doubt in anybody's mind what the West is facing here.
Right.
And it's an extraordinary move on the part of the Russians to do this, because we're talking about the Russians giving up
intelligence, surprise,
intelligence information, future surprise. So basically the Russians are saying, here is the RS-26 missile. Now, the bad news for America is, the good news is the Russians used a warhead I don't believe anybody was aware of. And so we learned a lot about this warhead. The bad news is we didn't learn anything about the avant-garde configuration or the nuclear weapon configuration, but that's okay. That's also good news. But so we didn't learn everything about this Rubiège, but we did learn, and hopefully, again, I'd like to believe that, I'm not in the business anymore. I would just tell you that if I were in the business, and that I would be screaming at top of my lungs about repositioning resources and assets to collect on this, because this is a once in a lifetime chance to get a look at this system before we all die. And because the system stopped, the Russians stopped testing this in 2017. I think that was the last operational test. Then the Russians mothballed the system. And so the RS-26 Rubiège has not been on our radar for 7 to 8 years. And now suddenly here it is. And I think the Russians, and you've got to, again, if I were briefing the president, I would say, this is not the action of a madman.
Right.
This is the action of a Russian leader who's desperately trying to prevent this thing from spinning out of control. If this was a madman,
like that thought of, this is not the action of a madman, gets interpreted through their lens of, oh, he's weak. That it's so dangerous. And I agree with you fully. Lavrov even said in his statement, I am trying to prevent a nuclear war. And it's like, okay, well, how are you trying to prevent a nuclear war? By effectively showing you strength and willingness and credibility and they don't see it. They just don't seem to see it. I mean, that's the most terrifying aspect of this, Scott.
Well, hopefully they will. Again, this is a wake-up call. I don't know, if they'll listen, but I sent a message out to the Trump transition team this morning, and I said, this has come to Jesus moment, guys. Whatever you think your policy towards Russia is, it has to change right now. You need to start talking to people about the reality of, where Russia is, and most importantly, about the need for arms control.
Yeah.
Even when Donald Trump Jr. and RFK Jr. wrote their op-ed piece for The Hill magazine, talking about a need to bring an end to this conflict in Ukraine and to prevent a nuclear war, there was no mention of arms control. I think right now the Trump administration needs to have a realistic talk about this and how it must lead with arms control, lead with disarmament. And the first thing is to come out and just say that we're abandoning the Biden administration strategy of strategic defeat. We're no longer seeking the strategic defeat of Russia. Therefore, you don't have to fear, and we're willing to put our, we're talking about mutual reduction. We're not talking about getting, Russia weakening itself. We're talking about working with Russia to lower the threshold. The first step towards disarmament is arms control. Arms control doesn't necessarily mean disarmament. It means stopping the arms race. It means bringing this out of control madness under control, to begin negotiations, to de-escalate, to do things that send signals that we're not leaning forward from nuclear war, we're pushing back. So, disarmament doesn't happen until you have confidence. It's not like we're going to start tomorrow and start cutting weapons. No. But what we need to do is start talking, saying, this is not the right trajectory. Can we both agree on that? And that's what we saw in the 60s and 70s. Before we got to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which eliminated, they brought it down from 20,000 down to 1,550, where we are today. Good stuff. But before we got there, we had the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. That is putting a cap on this massive arms race that was taking place, this explosion in the development of nuclear weapons by both the Russians and the Soviets. And so the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty slowed that down. You had SALT 1, boom. SALT 2 slowed it down. And then INF showed you could reduce. We got the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. We started reducing, boom. We're at the stage today where we need something like the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, where we just sit down with the Russians and say, whoa, let's put the brakes on all of this. Let's sit down and talk about where we're at and where we want to go and how we're going to get there. A joint conversation, not us coming in directing or the Russians demanding. No, stop, slow down. Whoa, okay, we're slowed down. Here's where we are. Do we want to be here? No. Where do we want to go? Well, we'd like to be there. How do we get there? And now we get into the talks about treaties and compliance verification mechanisms, things like that. But we're not having that dialogue today. Anatoly Antonov, this brilliant Russian ambassador who served in the United States, just left after 7 years. He was the guy that negotiated the last arms control treaty. He's the guy you want to be the ambassador to the United States right now. But because for 7 years, the United States government wouldn't talk to him, he went home. There's no Russian ambassador in the United States right now. Think about that. Russia just fired an ICBM against Ukraine, and there's no Russian ambassador. He had a defense attaché, a major general, who was a general in the strategic rocket forces of Russia. He is the guy that controls the Rubiège. And he was here ready to talk to us about arms control. Nobody talked to him.
But Scott, how does that work in a context where we are massively distrusted and we tend to be just aggressively dishonest? If you think about it, the JCPOA, we pulled out, as you pointed out, we pulled out of all of those nuclear treaties. the way that we've talked about this conflict, unprovoked war. Russia is trying to take over all of Europe. The killing of the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, even the Istanbul agreements being blown off immediately when the deal was on the table. Meaning, in the context of all of that stuff taking place, how on earth could Russia trust anything that comes out of the US president? I mean, even one, we won't move an inch to the east. All of these things were violated, even the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. They called it a revolution of dignity. So, how could you even get into a position to trust what is coming out of the US on something like this, to even move to that point of reduction or move to that point of freezing, especially when the next president that comes in could easily blow away anything that was negotiated, just like has taken place over the past administrations?
I mean, every point you raise is valid. I wrote a book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, about the experience of the INF Treaty.
Mhm.
In the book, and one of the reasons why I'm bringing up the book is, we learn from the lessons of the past. And the INF Treaty was negotiated in a time where there was no trust between the United States and the Soviet Union, none whatsoever. They didn't trust us. We didn't trust them. We assumed they cheated on everything. They assumed we cheated on everything. We assumed every time we met them, they were lying. They assumed every time we met, we were lying. I mean, just like today. And yet we sat down and went, we got to change this. We got to change this parameter. And we did. We negotiated a treaty mutually. It dealt with, it was a reciprocal treaty. What happened to them happened to us, mutually verifiable, and it worked. It worked. So I'm saying right now, yeah, there's a bunch of baggage here. There's no doubt about that. And is America going to have to lean over backwards to, I mean, the bottom line is the Russians have said, Anatoly Antonov told me, he said, we don't do arms control. If we do ever do arms control with you again, it's not going to be a resumption of business as usual.
Right.
We're going to need treaties that have measures that lock it in, that make it permanent, regardless of who's president. We're going to need you to put language in that treaty that locks you into this, that you can't just come out and withdraw, because otherwise, why are we doing this? We negotiate a treaty with you, and then 20 years later, you say it's inconvenient to you. No. So, there are parameters, but, Ronald Reagan brought up that old Russian proverb, doveraj no poveraj, trust but verify. And I think the Russians, it's their turn to sit down at the table and go, yeah, we trust, but we're going to have to verify the hell out of this one, guys, because we don't trust you, because you have broken trust, faith in the past, etc. That's okay. That's part of the negotiating process. And the beauty about being involved in negotiations is we're not trying to kill each other while we're talking,
Right.
that we're slowing this down. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. It's going to be one of the most difficult processes imaginable. But I always say this too about, somebody who's been in the military, etc. Anytime someone tells me, well, this negotiation is going to be tough, say, well, why don't you pick up a weapon, go to the front line, and call me in about 24 hours after you've gotten no sleep, all your friends are dead, your gut shot, bleeding out, and suddenly doesn't yak, 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 yak sound a hell of a lot better than bang, 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 bang? I mean, all these people talk about how difficult negotiation. Go get shot.
Yeah.
Go get shot and suddenly tell me, oh, it might be better that we had old men talking instead of young men shooting. So in the case of nuclear weapons, man, I want people talking. I want talking to the blue in the face. I don't care if we're pounding the table, screaming at each other. I mean, that's good because that's better than calm people sitting down with a nuclear suitcase open, reading out launch codes. I don't want that. I want people at the table angry, frustrated, throwing things, mad, and then agreeing. We're going to stop talking today. We're going to go home, get drunk, come in tomorrow, and start over again. Good. Because while we're doing that, nobody's punching the launch codes into a ballistic missile to fire it off and kill the world. So are negotiations going to be easy? No. The hardest thing we've ever done, especially given the history that you just talked about. But it's absolutely necessary to say that. And I will say this, too. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, I don't care. This is the point I'm going to make. He's revolutionary. He is the anti-establishment. You talked about how can they ever trust a president because the next one comes in. Understand this, when it comes to arms control and nuclear policy, it doesn't matter who the president is. It's run by the establishment. It's run by the deepest part of the deep state. It is the unelected permanent bureaucracy that doesn't change no matter who is the president. And we finally have a president who said, I'm taking that down.
Yeah.
This is the chance to come in and break the iron grip that the nuclear war establishment has on American defense policy. Trump can do it. This is the opportunity, and there's no better impetus for pushing him in that direction than what just happened.
I want to get your take on something. This is Keir Starmer. I think this is utterly deranged. But I want to get how you view this type of behavior.
Quickly, Russia
Let's see, get it.
has also threatened nuclear escalation. Are you comfortable with that when people at home are watching this, worrying that you could put us at risk?
Well, it's very important. It's very important that we're steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor,
Even if it unleashes nuclear war?
Russia has to be the one that makes the move to stop this war. It's within their gift, but we must support Ukraine. It's impacting not just Ukraine; it's impacting the rest of the world, including the UK.
Is your message to viewers back home that there will not be a nuclear war, because that is what Russia is threatening?
My message is that we need to ensure that Ukraine is put in the best possible position. This is 1,000 days of conflict.
Scott, that seems utterly and completely detached from reality to me. They're asking him point blank, are you willing to end the world over Ukraine? And his answer is apparently yes, because he's not giving her a straight answer, just saying, well, we have to keep supporting Ukraine. We have to keep supporting Ukraine. And people like Macron, I would even say Joe Biden, has effectively taken that stance. That seems utterly detached from reality to me.
But Keir Starmer's stance is premised on the official British government position that Russia's bluffing.
Right.
That's what he said. That's what his defense ministry has said. That's what his intelligence service say. Russia's bluffing. Putin's not going to do this. Quit threatening nuclear war. We know you're not going to do it. You're just posturing. And, Macron has said the same thing. Oh, he's not going to do this. And the United States, we're not worried. We don't see anything happening. Again, I just want to say that for the first time in the history of warfare, an ICBM was fired in anger. This changes everything. I'd like to see Keir Starmer answer that question now.
Well,
and I'd like to see him answer. Pardon?
Well, we're probably going to get it today. I mean, if they fire off additional storm shadow,
What's fascinating in all this, the Russians, I mean, love them or hate them, they provide a PhD class, a level class in diplomacy. The British and the Americans took the position that because before, remember, there was going to be high publicity. Starmer was coming in the White House. Biden was going to sign the authorization, official statements, release. Here they've taken the position of, we're just not going to talk about it. And as Zelensky said, we're going to let the missiles do the talking. Remember that? Zelensky, we're going to let the missiles do the talking. Well, I don't know if you saw Maria Zakharova, who's just a brilliant press spokesman for the Russians, was for the foreign ministry, was getting ready to answer questions, and she got a phone call. And it was a hot mic moment, very sloppy on her part, unless it was deliberate. We'll never know. Because she's so damn professional, I think it was deliberate. And she picked up the phone, and she knew she was on a hot mic. And the person on the other end said, "Maria, we're don't take any questions about the ballistic missile attack. We're not discussing that." She went, "Okay," and then she went on.
Really?
But the point is,
really?
that's just trolling. That's brilliant trolling, because she's too professional. She's too damn professional.
Yeah, that wasn't a mistake.
No, that was done on purpose. But notice, people ask Peskov, the Kremlin, what about this? We're not talking. That's a Ministry of Defense thing. They call the Ministry of Defense. That's a Kremlin thing. Russians to start talking about it. Maybe they're letting
nothing in the media about it.
Maybe they're letting the missile. Maybe they're letting the missile do the talking.
Yeah.
Zelensky's words going right back at him.
Let me ask you this: they are going with this argument of a domino theory, there are, and look, it's fun, it's completely ludicrous. But what they're saying is, well, if we don't fight them here, then what does it mean for Taiwan? And what does it mean for forces in these other locations? In fact, I want to go for a slightly different question on this. What is going on in Syria right now? Because there seems to be engagements even taking place in Syria where Russian military is in Syria, the US is in Syria, Turkey has a stake in Syria, and this seems to be utterly chaotic. And I strongly suspect that not only is Russia going to do something like this, it may be likely that the Houthis all of a sudden develop new rocketry technology, an amazing aim in the way that they hit that ship the other day, or groups in Syria may all of a sudden develop new rocketry technology. They may all of a sudden get amazing aim. Give me a take on that. What is taking place in Syria right now in regards to this kind of standoff among these nations?
Well, I mean, it's been this way for some time. Recall that 2011, the CIA undertook Operation.
They're trying to overthrow Assad.
Sycamore, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's the covert operation to get rid of Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
You remember Muammar Gaddafi fell. The
Uh-huh.
CIA immediately started shipping arms from Libya into Turkey to bring it into Syria to equip the Free Syrian, what they call the Free Syrian Army, which is a CIA-trained group of defectors. Saudi Arabia and Qatar started underwriting Islamic groups, Al-Qaeda and other Salafist groups. The United States did nothing to prevent the rise of ISIS because we viewed that as a perfect way of bringing down Assad. And Syria almost collapsed in 2014. Right. It was almost the end. The black flag of Islam almost flew over Damascus. Qasem Soleimani, a name that people might remember, he was the Iranian leader that Trump assassinated in 2020. Qasem Soleimani flew to Moscow and met with the Russians and said, "Look, you have to intervene. We're coming in and we're doing what we can, but we need decisive intervention that only Russia can bring." And in 2015, at the invitation of the Syrian government, Russia deployed air forces and limited ground forces to Syria, which not only stabilized the situation but turned the tables on them. Since that time, the United States, has intervened. We occupy 1/3 of Syria. Turkey has intervened because the United States made allies with Kurdish forces that the Turks considered to be terrorists. So the Turks have intervened, and you just have this situation where the Syrian government has stabilized itself. It's backed by the Russians, but 1/3 of its country is occupied by the United States, which no longer has a viable anti-Assad posture. So we don't know why we're there, but Turkey's saying get out too. And so
it's just
could there be a situation where there's a qualitative improvement in the weapon systems of anti-American Syrian militias, anti-American Iraqi militias? The answer is yes, there will be. Could the Houthi suddenly find themselves in possession of Onyx anti-shipping missiles? I think they will. But the Russians have to play this. The Russians are, again, smarter than the average dog. And for all the Russians listening, that's not meant to be an insult. That's meant to be a compliment. When your enemy's losing, don't get in the way of their defeat.
Right, let them lose.
The United States is losing. And remember, Russia looks at things that go beyond simply troops on the ground. They're looking at geopolitical posturing, what the balance of power, the correlation of power is going to be post-American involvement in Syria. How do they maximize this? And it's not just about making America diminished in the region, but Russia is concerned about Iran having too much influence and the destabilizing impact that would have on Israel. So Russia's playing a very complicated game here. Balancing sides off against the other, including Turkey, wanting to be strategic allies with Turkey, but not giving Turkey too much, leverage here and there. The Russians are very, very, very patient and very, very, very clever. And they don't think tactically; they think strategically. And I think that's the problem, because in the West we tend to look at it and say, well, how, on a day-to-day basis, oh, a militia attacked us today. We've now got a posture to respond to that
Right.
militia. That's all that matters. And the Russians just look at that and say, that's America losing control. We're just going to let it happen.
Yes, posturing, hubris, all
And
that stuff.
Russia has to be careful when we talk about the qualitative improvement in weaponry, that Russia doesn't push it too far to get America to
Respond.
stop talking
Right.
about leaving, instead talk about reinforcing. So the Russians are playing, and again, we in the West interpret Russian patience as Russian weakness.
Right.
But the fact is, because the American response is to send an aircraft wing, fly airplanes over, and say, "Hey, look how strong we are." And the Russian thing is, okay, you do that, but that just cost you $5 billion that you don't have. You've postured. We're just going to wait a month and a half, and you're going to send those forces home because you didn't get the fight you wanted, and now you're bankrupt, and we're still where we were. We're stronger now. That's the Russian approach.
Scott, 30 seconds. Are you concerned that this gets out of control before Trump gets in office?
Yes, I'm very concerned that this gets out of control, because I don't have any faith and confidence in the Biden administration to accept the message that Russia's put on the table. We need decisive intervention by the Trump transition team right now. I know the Logan Act and precedent argues against it, but Trump needs to tell Biden, the American people spoke on November 5th. They said no to your policies. They said yes to me coming in and fixing things, and now you're trying to screw things up. That's violating the mandate given to me by the American people, and I won't stand for it. And he really needs to come out and speak forcefully, not just to the American people and to the Biden administration, but to the Russians, and let them know that there will be changes on January 20th, that regardless of what Biden's doing now, Trump isn't going to be doing. He needs to articulate this so that the Russians understand that there will be a difference between post-January 20th and what's going on right now.
Scott, I agree with everything that came out of your mouth, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You greatly appreciate it. Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. And of course, as he pointed out, he has books. You can pick up his books also. Thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. I definitely appreciate your point of view. All right.
Thank you.
I want to go to our next guest. We have an excellent, it is working, Ehsan Safanejad. He is with us today. He is I know you don't like saying this, but whatever. I'm saying it anyway. Iran-based journalist who shares his analysis on news, geopolitics of Iran, the Middle East, Russia, China, and the global South. Ehsan, man, how you doing today? You doing all right? Oh, don't tell me this is going to be an issue again. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I am going to have to contact him through Google Hangouts. So if you guys can give me 1 second. Let's see. So let's do this. Let's take a quick break. I'm going to come back with my guest. He's awesome. The wait is worthwhile. I promise you. And he is going to give us a rundown on what is taking place in Iran, because there is some fascinating politics that is underway that I don't know what is going to take place coming out of Iran. And I'm not even sure if Iran knows what's going to take place coming out of Iran, especially coming with the Trump administration and Iran still saying that they are going to attack. We're going to get what's taking place on the ground and what they're talking about in country. I'll be back in a moment. All right. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try it. Eshan, can you hear me? Okay, wait a minute. Use microphone. Allow. All right. Eshan, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. You can hear me. All right. Now, for the audience, can you all hear me? And that's the catch. Let's see. All right. They are not seeing what I am seeing. I am trying to get them to see this. Hold on. Give me 1 second, Eshan. Give me 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. Oh, I think I screwed up. All right, give me 1 second, guys. I'm trying to get this to work right, and it is not working right. Okay, here we are. All right, I can see you here. And let's see if I can get the present to reach out to that screen. All right, it says this. Oh, it doesn't see it. It doesn't see it. Damn it. Damn it. All right. This Eshan, for some reason, man, it's not connecting. Oh. All right. Yeah, it's okay. Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. All right. Excellent. 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 And let's see, one more thing. All right, guys, can you hear me? All right. Guys, can you hear me? Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, yes, they can hear us. Okay, great. Great, great, great. All right. Eshan, man, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate it. I am going to balloon this up so everybody can see. And good. We are connected. Excellent. Technology. What is that? Damn technology. How you doing today? You doing all right? Yeah, it's this world is in chaos, to put it mildly. The reason I brought you on, though, there's been a lot of talk that Iran is going to respond. I mean, it has been very loud that Iran is going to respond. They were calling it True Promise 3. But there seemed to be somewhat of a contradiction in the government because the government seemed to have wanted more of economic interaction. In the press here in the US, there were reports that Elon Musk had reached out and had conversation with one of the ministers or ambassadors for Iran. Now, Iran said that's not true. They said that didn't happen. But Iran has a reason to deny that. And there's an argument to be made that Trump may want to come to some kind of terms with Iran, but that is under the model that under no circumstances would he do that if Iran attacks Israel. What is going on inside the country? Are they talking about True Promise 3? What is the conversation going on in Iran? Mhm, mhm. One second. I am being told that they can't. Oh, they can't see and they can't hear you. They can't see you and they can't hear you. Damn it. All right. We are going to have to try to find a way to work with the technology to get this to work right. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Let me let you go, okay? And I'll reach out to you at the end of the show. All right. I'm sorry. Okay. All right, guys. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about that. I just saw that they can't hear and they can't see, and I need to figure out how to get the technology for that to work right. You have my apologies. Eshan, when he comes back, we're going to get the opportunity to figure out what is going on with that. For some reason, StreamShare is not working with the technology in Iran. And when I'm trying to find other ways to go around it, you can't hear it, or for that matter, you can't see it. So I'm not sure how to quite fix that yet, but we'll find a way to make that work. In the meantime, I want to go into another story. Scott Ritter was fantastic. I want to give Scott Ritter my thanks. And again, the big story for today is the attack that took place with the ICBM hitting Ukraine. What is the name of that place? What is it? The Nets? No, it's not Petrovsk or Dnipro, Petrovsk or Dnipro, that area. And they hit apparently a missile making facility. But again, they didn't need that missile to do it. That missile we used to make a point. A, it could potentially be nuclear tip. B, they can't stop it. C, it can hit anywhere in Europe, including anywhere in Ukraine. And so the entire point was to take an act that was serious enough and demonstrated severity without necessarily going too far in demonstration of that severity. Because again, if you go too far, you kind of mess the point up. The first use of the ICBM, I didn't realize that was the first time it was ever used, but the first use of the ICBM was just use. And as Scott pointed out, the next escalation of that could be Kiev. I want to point something out. If you notice, the reports yesterday was that there was going to be a missile attack on Kiev, in which case the embassies shut down. The embassies didn't get hit. That building got hit in Dnipro. All right. But is it a coincidence that A, the reports were Kiev is going to get hit, and then B, somewhere else in Ukraine gets hit? Meaning, are those things connected? Is it a warning of you will be next if you continue to escalate? And is that the warning that is being communicated to the Western powers? So when Keir Starmer is asked the question, are you willing to go to nuclear war for Ukraine? And he can't answer that question directly with a no or yes, but he implies yes. And my question was, do they believe Putin is bluffing? Or are they in the mindset of, we want a war, we are expecting a war, we've invested hundreds of billions of dollars into this grift, and we don't necessarily want to let it go? One of my biggest fears when I was working at the network and I was watching this war take place, I was horrified that it was happening in the first place, because again, this is a modern war. This is not a side conflict. These are nations going at each other with hundreds of thousands of people being killed in World War II type battles. This is not something that we've seen since the last 50 years. People are dying on a massive scale. B, the reason and rationalization for this war. Again, there was the Minsk agreements 1 and 2, and you end up with a situation where Angela Merkel coming out saying, we lied. We lied. A deal that was supposed to end the conflict was done in order to allow Ukraine time to build up a massive military, by the way, that was going to be on the Russian border. Meaning this never needed to happen. It is a catastrophe that never needed to take place. And then you get the dishonesty. It was unprovoked. This was a revolution of dignity, et cetera, et cetera. So from my point of view, I was horrified by the fact that it was happening at all. Blown away by it. How do you... I was always concerned that the investment that they were putting into it, that they wouldn't back away when it was clear that they lost. And if they didn't back away, when it became obvious, brimmingly clear that they lost, how far would they be willing to go? And would they relinquish? Would they accept the loss? Or would they try to continuously escalate, even understanding that they lost? The Attack Adams missile goes into that thought of escalation, despite the fact that they lost. They only have apparently 50 missiles, or less than 50 at this point. It's not going to change the context of the war. And despite them knowing it won't change the context of the war, they still did it anyway, knowing full well that Putin said this was a red line. Now, the catch and the question for the West, that will most likely be answered today. Do you hear him now? Do you believe him now? Or do you look at that and say, well, yeah, but that was a plant, in Dnipro. That's not Kiev. He doesn't have the stones to hit Kiev. Once again, using this notion of pragmatism and efforts to avoid a war and considering it as weakness. How will the West respond? And that, for better or for worse, is what we're going to learn today. And I suspect we will learn that within the next 5-10 hours. If you find them firing off additional Storm Shadow missiles, if you find them firing off additional Attack Adams missiles, then the message would have been, we still think that you're bluffing. And if you heard Ritter's point of view was that they needed to flatten Kiev, because he didn't believe that they were going to accept it any other way. That's disturbing, but that is where we are. We are whistling past the graveyard in real terms. Look, we have an Xbox culture of sorts. We have not been in a firing line where we have been under this notion of war or conflict. We do engage in wars, but those things are typically off our shores in other countries, meaning our modus operandi is to not have wars on our shores. What I don't think Europe fully understands is that the same way that we're using Ukrainians right now as a battering ram to the last dead Ukrainian, where we don't really care that much about Ukrainians losing their lives to the hundreds of thousands. In fact, if you remember, Jake Sullivan came out recently saying, you need to get your young boys. You have kids. that you can throw into the meat grinder. Well, you need to do that. You need to do that. Your issue is not so much the attack items. That's not going to really change anything. You need manpower. So you need to take your kids and throw them into the breach. That's what they were saying. We don't care that they are dying. And so in the same way that we consider Ukraine that way, the assumption is that if a war breaks out, it will break out on European continent, not in America. So Europe, from our point of view, and from the most cynical war planners' point of view, will be used in the same way that Ukraine is being used to fight the Russians. That any damage, any destruction, any chaos will take place on the European continent, and America would be blissfully away, safe, while assisting in the war. Europe doesn't seem to understand that we're not in it together. You are also proxies, or will be used as proxies in any conflict that kicks off between Russia and NATO in direct fire. They're putting their own populations at risk. And the question I would ask is, what is it for? Even if you think Russia is the bad guy, even if you think that all of this is unprovoked, are you really willing to risk the end of the world in order to keep Ukraine inside your geopolitical sphere of influence? And do you think your populations would be willing to do that? And I want you to consider for the moment that the people who are running this policy are failed politicians. Keir Starmer is massively hated. He is utterly and completely despised. Macron has lost his governing majority and is only in right now, meaning the person who Macron has been able to pick, he's only been able to do so in somewhat of a de facto coup, considering that his party failed in the national elections and in the parliamentary elections from the standpoint of Europe. And Germany has collapsed. Germany has utterly and completely collapsed. So the reality of it is, yeah, they have utterly and completely collapsed. So the catch becomes, okay, so who's making these choices? If you're thinking about it, Joe Biden has lost his mandate. He has failed miserably in his task. And now that he's failed miserably in his task, he's lost his mandate. He has decided that the investment of $200 billion means that we can kick it up a notch further. Maybe even going with this belief that Putin, believing that Trump is going to take a different policy, is not willing to risk Armageddon. I think Joe Biden is wrong. Russia has been invaded multiple times, using Ukraine as a pathway for that invasion. They have been in a war where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. I think we are looking at this through very different lenses. The lens they're looking at it is existential, and existential from a point of view where they have already been ensconced in killing. We are looking at this as if we are blissfully away from it. And that, honestly, in the same way that Scott said he was terrified, I am also terrified of the potential outcome of this. We will see. We will see. I don't think Biden is the fall guy, Frank. Look, Biden has an ideology. And regardless of people saying that he's not in, his right mind, fair enough. I don't think he's in his right mind. But I do think he has an ideological direction that he wants to go. And there's a level of hubris, there's a level of ego, and all those things are wrapped into this radical humiliation of getting involved into a war in which he lost. And you must understand, it is not just the issue of Ukraine. In fact, I would say Ukraine matters the least of this. The issue is NATO and Western standing in the world. Does NATO have the capability to materially affect a situation on the ground in some conflict? And in the case for Ukraine, they bet it all on Ukraine. They were going to militarily destroy Russia. They were going to economically destroy Russia. And if you look at the levels now, Russia has moved up into the number 4 spot in regards to economies. And from the standpoint of militaries, they have the strongest military in Europe. They've fundamentally failed and got hundreds of thousands of people killed in the process. I don't know. It's just outrageous. I'm always shocked by the level of cynicism associated with this conflict and this war and what they've been willing to do in order to maintain a sphere of influence around Ukraine. And understand the entire point of this was to surround Russia. The goal after the fall of the Soviet Union is we will never have another peer competitor to us in the way that the Soviet Union was. And so we expanded to the border. And at the point where we expanded to the border, we knock over the government of Ukraine. From our point of view, any conflict that takes off, if Ukraine is part of NATO, is a fait accompli. They are militarily surrounded. Russia knows that, in which case they take muscular action to stop it. We would have done the exact same thing. I guess my fear, or at the very least my hope, is that that fire from the ICBM will be accepted with the gravity it deserves. My fear is that it is not. My fear is that it is not. I want to move on to a different story. There is a bit of weirdness taking place in Philadelphia, well, in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to debate which one do I want to do. You know what? Let's do AOC. Let's do AOC. Bernie Sanders has been fighting in order to block funding going to Israel. And there's a $20 billion that he is effectively saying, look, we are breaking our laws by allowing them and giving them money and giving them weapons and so forth. They're starving people, literally starving people. They are blowing up hospitals. They are leveling neighborhoods. Yesterday, they killed 88 people in the killing and blowing up a neighborhood and destroying a neighborhood. Information was coming out from the UN that people were basically dying from starvation, kids, babies dying from starvation. And Seymour Hersh points out that they are going to occupy and annex the West Bank. This was something Seymour Hersh came out with yesterday. So all of this was taking place yesterday. All of this stuff was becoming aware yesterday. All right. Sanders comes out and says this in the well of Congress. 18 senators voted with him on this. Everyone else voted against him in order to allow funding to go through. But listen to his argument, and you tell me whether or not he's right.
I've heard members of the U.S. Senate come to this floor to denounce human rights violations taking place around the world. I've heard well-founded concerns about China's brutal reception of the Uyghur ethnic minority. I've heard rightful outrage about Putin's brutal attacks against Ukraine and bombing of civilian installations. I've heard genuine concern about Iran's outrageous crackdown on peaceful protesters. I've heard repeated condemnations of Saudi Arabia's terrible treatment of women and political dissidents. And on it goes. A lot of folks come to the floor to talk about human rights and what's going on throughout the world. But what I want to say to all those folks, nobody is going to take anything you say with a grain of seriousness. You cannot condemn human rights around the world and then turn a blind eye to what the United States government is now funding in Israel. People will laugh in your face. They will say to you, you're concerned about China, you're concerned about Russia, you're concerned about Iran. Well, why are you funding the starvation of children in Gaza right now?
He's completely right. He's completely right. How do you run with this idea that we're love and light? We are, the great nation. We have ethics, morality, and everything else. And yet we are paying for and literally funding a genocide that can't take place without us putting our money and political weight behind it. For the political weight part, you get a vote in the UN Security Council. The United States is the only country that decides to vote against a ceasefire in Gaza. This guy, Linda Greenfield is usually there, but he's there today. Listen to what he says, and you tell me whether or not this is the most ridiculous thing you have heard
conflict.
this year.
Let's
start from the beginning.
The United States also, over the course of the past year, has done more than any other country to take tangible steps to improve the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, even as the situation remains dire. We have also done more than anyone to work with the government of Israel in an effort to minimize civilian harm over the course of the conflict. The United States also, over the course of the past year, has done more than any other country to take tangible steps to improve.
Think about that. Think about that. The notion that you can literally fund a genocide, 70% of the money that goes into it comes from us. And despite us paying 70% and giving diplomatic and political support, he's even ironic, exponentially ironic, because he is standing there giving Israel diplomatic cover in just the way he goes about what he's doing right now. And yet he still makes the argument, we and no one has done more than us. No one has done more than us. Outrageous. But I want to bring in my guests. I am joined with the one and only Ted Rawl, syndicated columnist and host of TMI, Too Much Information, that comes on from 10 to 12 on YouTube. Definitely check him out. What's going on, Ted? How you doing this morning, man? You doing all right?
I'm doing great. I'm actually celebrating the fact that for the first time in 4 months, New York City's seen a little rain. So, yeah.
Really?
And,
it's been that long?
It's been, yeah, no, it hasn't been a drop in 4 months. It's not much. It's just a few little drops, but I'm hoping it, the reservoirs are dangerously low that feed New York City. They're at about half of what they need to be. And so, it's a major drought, something that New York has not really had to think about ever before. But yeah, so it's good. I'm also very, very pleased about these ICC criminal arrest warrants against Bibi Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. It's not like the ICC
so they
always
did drop.
does the right thing.
I didn't see it this morning, so it did drop.
It just broke. They just dropped about half an hour ago. So Yoav Gallant and Bibi Netanyahu now have formal arrest warrants out for them. They don't always do the right thing. I mean, the arrest warrants for Putin were stupid. But,
yeah, those are absurd.
But the point is, you still got to take your wins where you can get them.
Well, that is great.
The Israelis are going to go crazy. I mean, they're going to just completely lose it because it's such an embarrassment for them.
I mean, but think of like everything that it took for them to even get it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they were attacking one of the lawyers. They were going after him. Apparently, they told him behind the scenes that arrest warrants are for these kind of African dictators, not for us, and get back on script. I mean, they were threatening him. The Attack the Hague Act? Because that's the other part. The United States passed that act under George Bush that allows us to attack the Hague, attack the criminal court if they arrest Americans or allies of America. Israel will count under that. It's just astonishing. But I agree with you. I'm glad that they did file those arrest warrants. If anybody deserves, he does. Obviously, the man's a war criminal. I don't even know how that's even argued at this point. And yet, there are people on the Republican side of the aisle that full well believe that he is loving light and that everything he's doing is perfectly legitimate and okay. It's just how.
Well, he is loving life. He's loving life. He's depriving too many other people of life is the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Ted, I wanted your take on before we get into the other conversation, the ICBM launch. Apparently, this is the first time an ICBM has ever been launched. And Russia is clearly trying to get across the seriousness of the situation. A, they can't knock it down. B, it can run or contain a nuclear warhead. And there's another small point that I don't think people get either. The warning apparently went for Kiev, but the attack was in Dnipro. And from my point of view, I am going with this notion that it's a threat to Kiev. Basically, look, we launched this. We are serious about this. You need to take our seriousness. We're not bluffing on this. And in the same way we warned you about Kiev, it could be next, and you can't do anything about it. do you think they're going to accept the seriousness of the situation, or do you think they're going to stay with the cynicism of, oh, Putin is totally bluffing? Give me your thoughts.
I think it's insane, but I think they're going to stay with that cynicism. I mean, part of the problem for the Ukrainians is that, I mean, this is a problem that, a lot of political and corporate leadership has around the world, including here in the United States. There's no one at the table who's, has a dissenting point of view, who's being heard, right? I mean, there's no one with Zelensky's ear who's could be who'd be willing to express a dissenting opinion and say, listen, we don't want to go too far here. I'm not saying that they don't consider that, but there's no one who advocates that position stridently within the Zelensky cabinet. I'm sure of that. Just like there's no one who does that in the U.S. cabinet or in the Situation Room in the White House. And I think that's the problem. I mean, I think the Russians are, look, another development happened yesterday, and I don't know if we should make anything out of it, but there were some major cyber glitches in the U.S. yesterday. The Airbnb, Reddit, a bunch of other websites were, Cloudflare, were all down and hinky and weird. And look, it might not mean anything, but it definitely had, a lot of this stuff had the hallmarks of hacking. And, it's like, well, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked someday to learn that, like, Russia was like sending us a little shot across the bow, like, cut it out, like, we can get you, we know where you live, we can mess you up. Countries do this to each other. The U.S. has done it to Russia, many times. And so I think what, right now, the Kremlin is definitely in a stop messing with us mode.
Right.
And they're like, and they're also saying, like, look, what's happening here is that the Ukrainians and their ally, the outgoing Biden administration, are in an act of desperation, right? They know that the war is lost. Even, really, truly, that's now in the Western media, Reuters, everybody's saying the war is lost for Ukraine.
Right.
So this is like, well, let's, they just don't want to accept it. And they're also thinking, if we have to negotiate a peace deal with Putin, let's negotiate from a position of strength. And the best way to do that is to lash out now, and just be like, full spectrum, honey badger. I personally think that's an insane approach, but they always think that, right? The Americans thought that at the end of the Vietnam War, so they ratcheted up the bombing. It's the same exact mentality. So that's all to say that, everybody's kind of like doing what they're supposed to. Often people look at the calm, very measured, extremely, ice water for blood, Vladimir Putin. And those are all compliments as far as I'm concerned, by the way. And they view him either as a bluffer or as weak, or, or like someone that, like, they can, like, do a workaround, like by being ferocious and insane. That doesn't work. I mean, that's not keeping Putin up at night. And
right.
It's like, it wouldn't keep anyone smart up at night. They know, you can see right through it. It's transparent. I just think they're definitely they're not taking this as seriously as they ought to, because ultimately, in the end, Putin will defend Russia's national interests. And if a certain line is crossed that he feels just like it can't be allowed to pass, otherwise national security is at stake, then he's going to take it to the next level. And
Agreed.
Nobody wants that, including him.
I don't know what the U.S. wants at this point. Because they can't be this stupid. I mean, they are whistling past the graveyard in real terms. He just fired off an ICBM to get across, we are serious. And these people in the U.S. in their comfortable suits, in their comfortable tables, eating and getting their Starbucks, they are not in the same mindset of a country that has been at war for the last 3 years, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, meaning Russians have been killing and dying for the last 3 years. And this is happening on their border. They have 80% approval rating, meaning the country is fully behind them on this because they understand this is on that border. And now they are going so far as say, yeah, fire off missiles in Russia. Let's screw it. Let's do it. And then you get attack Adams missile in one day, then the very next day you get Storm Shadow missiles, meaning they were escalating over the course of those few days. And so I would imagine from Putin's point of view, I think Scott Ritter is right. If you leave it to their devices, they are going to continue to escalate one item by the next, whether it's, okay, now we're going to get anti-personnel mines. Then it's going to be Poland is going to be able to shoot out Russian missiles as they fly across the border. And at some point, you will get troops in Ukraine. And Russia's statement, Lavrov, he was very clear. He said, we are trying to prevent a nuclear war. And what Lavrov meant by that is that we need to demonstrate seriousness to such a degree that they stop the escalation. Because if they continue on this ladder of escalation, we will get to the point where, as you said, we will defend the sovereignty of this nation, even if it means ending the world.
Right.
It's a sword holder position. In the three-body problem in the book series, there was a position called the sword holder. And the main responsibility of the sword holder was to be willing to end the world. That was his job at a moment's notice. And the fact that he was willing to end the world, and they knew he was willing to end the world, was the thing that kept the world safe. I feel like it's the same situation in a weird way. If the US and Europe is not actually looking for a war, then the belief in the seriousness that Putin would end the world if he needed to defend Russia would be the thing that stays their hand and prevent them from going further with the escalation. If they don't believe that, then they escalate. It is an irony of sorts, but this is a position that we've found ourselves in. And again, this is not happening on the border of Texas. This is happening on the border of Russia. And this is happening in Russia, no less. I mean, in Kursk. It's just outrageous. Like the idea that he loses a democratic election, loses his point of view, loses because Kamala Harris was just given the Joe Biden point of view. And instead of understanding, okay, the American public is not for what I'm doing, they're against us. Even in the polling, when you look at what they want, they're against it. A democratic choice is against it, a no confidence vote. And he still is like, this charade is coming to an end. I went with this Ukraine project and tried to keep Ukraine in the sphere of influence for the last 3 years. And we have been willing to get all of these people killed in this process. And I would imagine he's thinking to himself, what was it for? It's, I don't know, man. It's just outrageous.
I mean, it's a double. And the thing is, I mean, it's a double loss for Biden and his administration, right? I mean, not only did he had to drop out. And then his surrogate, his sitting vice president, whom he appointed, lost also. And the House of Representatives, which had been expected to go Democratic, did not. And so, I mean, you know, look, the foreign policy of the Biden administration has been rebuked. I'm not going to go so far as to say that, like, let's say Ukraine was the primary issue. I don't think anyone believes that. But it was, look, here, let's just put it this way. It wasn't supporting Ukraine obviously wasn't high enough of a priority for American voters for them to vote for Harris, right? So this is the foreign policy of the incoming administration differs from the outgoing administration. It is rotten to interfere with that foreign policy. It reminds me a little bit of, you know, the deal that Reagan made with Iran in order to keep the hostages after the election, or as we learned in the last few years, in 1968, the deal that Nixon made with North Vietnam
but see, this is
in order to undermine Humphrey. It's frankly, it's treasonous.
I know, I agree with you, but it is slightly different because in this case, Joe Biden is still president. Like in those cases, those people were coming into office. Joe Biden is trying to screw over the position of the person coming in and blowing off the will of the American public in doing so. It's just outrageous.
That's right.
Like what they're willing to risk is just astonishing to me. Like the level of recklessness is mind blowing, and they don't seem to appreciate it with the gravity it deserves. And what I'm hoping is that ICBM missile launch doesn't. We will find out today if there are more missiles flying into Russia. I would imagine the next step is flattening Kiev. It's just outrageous. Ted, I wanted to get into Mayor Adams for a bit. What is going on in New York right now? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, you know, it's the same old, right? I mean, aside from the fact that we're seeing the first drops of rain, We still have all the usual problems. There was an act of spasmodic random violence a few days ago when a homeless man went on a rampage in Midtown Manhattan and stabbed 3 random strangers to death, with giant butcher knives in the middle in broad daylight. What was striking to me about that was if that incident had occurred in Midtown Manhattan in, let's say 20 years ago, the guy wouldn't have gotten far. Okay. He was on the loose for 2.5 hours after the first one, walked across town, did the second one, covered with blood. Okay. Now, how did that happen? It's because there's no cops. Okay. There are no cops anywhere. You don't see cops. So it's still that lawlessness, that sense that there's, if you need help, you're well and truly in trouble in the city. So, I mean, we still have this, the migrant situation is completely unabated. I would say the anger at like the soaring rents coupled, there's something wrong when the quality of the service that you're receiving in rent, which is basically not just for a unit of housing, but it's where that unit of housing is, right? It's like and location, right?
Yes,
the location's not great right now in New York. Like, I pay $4,915 a month for my 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side. That's a pretty good deal here.
Are you serious? Wait, Ted, wait.
That could be
Did
6,000.
You say 4,000?
Almost $5,000. Yeah, for 49
for a 2-bedroom.
For a 2-bedroom. Now the thing is, and it's not like it's not a doorman building. It's a buzzer building. It's not in a fancy building. I don't have a view. So the point is that like my situation's not unusual, and every time I pay that rent check, like every New Yorker, I'm like, why am I paying this? This is like, if I were paying $2,000 a month, like it was the old Lou Reed days in the late 70s, and they were cool, it was edgy, but it was cheap, and there were cool, like, boutiques and funky bars and like underground clubs and to go to, all those are gone, right? Everything's been, mallified. There's like, we have the same stores as, you have in like Tuscaloosa. So like, what's the point? And New Yorkers are surly. They're in a bad mood. And then we've got this mayor who frankly shouldn't be in office because he and his cronies have all been indicted on a variety of credible corruption charges that, are pretty embarrassing. And it's kind of like every time you wake up, you're like, Mayor Adams, wait, how come those two words still go together? I don't
he's
understand.
still there.
Yeah,
he
there.
is holding on to that position like grim death.
He sure is.
He seems to have no F's to give. He seems to have taken a sympathetic eye towards Trump, which is fascinating. I want to get to it, but I want to go to something else real quick. Matt Gaetz. So the ethics committee was looking into Matt Gaetz. Donald Trump picks him for the AG, and he says, all right, I'm out. And he jumps out of Congress. Because that way the ethics committee doesn't have to get him. So they're still meeting, and they met to decide whether or not they were going to release the report on Gaetz. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, they come up with the view, deadlocked. No, we're not going to release it. All right. New York Times ends up getting a leak that details drug-fueled orgies that Gaetz had been having. And not just the drug-fueled orgies, but also the lines, meaning the payments, whether it was Venmo, whether it was Apple Pay, they were able to get all of those records in addition to who the payments were going to for a host of women. They even had the lawyer for 2 of the women to talk with the paper. And apparently one of the women saw Matt Gaetz hook up with the 17-year-old. There was the other situation where a friend of Matt Gaetz gets busted, get put in prison for 11 years, was working with the cops on the case with Matt Gaetz, basically cooperating with the cops on it. Apparently, Gaetz and his friend, at the very least for the payments that they could find, paid up to $10,000 for sex, drugs, orgies. And this was something that was rather routine considering the list and the lines go to all of these men and women. Gates was being investigated for sex trafficking. I would imagine that deals with the whole thing of the prostitution across state lines.
Mm-hmm.
He was being investigated for sex with a minor. That has to do with the 17-year-old. But from the standpoint of drugs and orgies, that seems to be intact. The one caveat, though, he wasn't indicted, meaning they didn't press charges on Gates. They closed that case.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that's a long way around it. But what's super interesting to me is that it was leaked. And it was leaked in order to damage Gates's chances of going through the confirmation hearings. Isn't that fascinating? Like Gates has enemies to the point that they were trying to put a knife in him by releasing the report from the cops. I mean, because this was a federal investigation that was leaked on Gates. Give me your thoughts on that. I'm fascinated by that. Clearly, somebody is out for Gates.
Yeah, well, he's got obviously both enemies and also allies, right? And it's I'm less interested in the enemies than the allies. It's like the enemies are self-evident, right? I mean, obviously, it's self-serving for Democrats to come after him for obvious reasons, and a lot of Republicans hate him as well. He's declared war on the establishment, so it's like. This is, and it wouldn't be the first time that sexual peccadillos are used to bring someone down. You don't really care about their sexual peccadillos, but you're just you're going after them. And we can think of a bunch of people like that. The interesting thing is who's watching out for him. I mean, sure, there's the knee-jerk. Well, us Republicans got to stick together, and if he goes down, it makes us all look bad. Then there's always like where Ted Rawls' mind goes, which is like. There, but for the grace of God, goes some other countries.
But come on, Ted, you weren't having drug-fueled sex orgies, like over the course of God knows how long, buying prostitutes. I'm having.
No, that's true, but it's like I could definitely see that. He's probably not the only person in Washington D.C. who had those kind of habits. Governor Spitzer, call your office. Or call the front desk of the Mayflower. There's a I think that the real interesting thing is why is he protected at all? I mean, you would just normally say this guy's he's radioactive, he's kryptonite, just cut him loose, he's too much trouble. And what does he bring to the table? I mean, obviously he brings a certain ferret like energy to the MAGA movement that is appreciated in some quarters. The fact that he was I don't make as much as others do about the fact that he was appointed AG. I mean, Alberto Gonzales was AG. Right. He tortured people. I mean, that's worse.
Yeah, the choice
murdered people, burned up children for fun. That's pretty bad. So I think it's like there's been some scoundrels who've had that position before. Palmer, of the Palmer raids in 1919. The scum of the earth, he was AG. So it's not like unprecedented. It's just it's a circus though. I think correct me if I'm wrong, Jamal, but I get the idea. You're kind of like there's more to this than we can see, and it's kind of bugging you. That's how I feel.
Yes, that's how I feel
what
about
it is, but it's there. It's like it's an itch. It's like you ever see Double Indemnity, the Edward G. Robinson character, and he says like, whenever I get a case that bothers me, my little man won't leave me alone, and like my little man is kind of telling me there's more to this, and I don't know what
more
it
to
is.
The story, because there's another part to this, right? When he goes to try to go through confirmation, he is going to be under oath in front of Congress, and if they ask him, "Hey, did you have sex with a 17-year-old?" They can ask him that under oath.
Sure.
Hey, did you pay for prostitutes to cross state lines? Again, that would be illegal, right? Meaning they can ask him stuff that they can prove and verify that is true or false based on the reports that the FBI did on Gates. And if Gates is put in a situation where he has to say, "I plead the fifth," pleading the fifth is as bad as admitting guilt. Like he releasing that report puts him in somewhat of a bind as he goes through that confirmation hearing.
Unless he doesn't have to, unless it's a recess appointment and he doesn't have to go through it.
There's that part. There's that part too.
I keep thinking, I know it's outlandish, but I could see. So, in Hitler's rise to power, right? And I don't like to make a lot of Trump-Hitler comparisons. I don't believe in them for the most part, but I like this one. So, one of the first, he came to power democratically in accordance with the parliamentary procedure. And then shortly after, and what really consolidated his power was when the Reichstag passed something called the Enabling Act, which basically said whenever the Führer of the German nation, the Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, proposes a bill, it is automatically rubber stamped by the German Reichstag. It technically, it has gone through the Reichstag process, but we're just not going to debate or anything. It's automatically approved, right? And this, I think if you have mass confirmations of part or all of Trump's picks for the cabinet in a recess appointment, like we're doing them all. We're doing the ambassador to Peru, all of them. Everything's pushed through all at once. Boom. I mean, you can see the advantages from Trump's point of view. I mean, if I were president, I'd love it. It's just like no stress. Everybody gets through. Bam, I get my nominees. I don't have to deal with situations like you're describing, Jamal, in terms of Gates. He gets in. It's done. No muss, no fuss. But that's a little bit like an Enabling Act light. It's the Senate abdicating its advice and consent function and relinquishing its own power, which is something that people in Washington don't normally do. Being the one of the big deals about serving in the Senate is this power to confirm or deny presidential appointments and many other positions that we never talk about. So, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a strong sense of how the Republican leadership is going to handle this. I could easily see them going along with it because they would say, this will save Trump trouble, but it's going to save us trouble too.
Right.
Because we don't want to be at war with the administration. We just, and this way it gets done, but our fingerprints aren't all over like approving Matt Gaetz or having to deny him.
Because that's a gross approval. I mean, the Democrats are clearly going to bring up, well, what about the 17-year-old? Meaning they're going to ask some questions to humiliate with the idea of making him radioactive to choose. So now I agree with you on this. Yeah, we're going to see. I'm getting contradictory information. Like on some points, they're like, yeah, we're going to ask questions. We're going to, hold them accountable. And you have some people who come in and say, I don't like this particular pick. But you have other people that comes across as, Trump won. He's going to shake things up. This is one of his picks. We're going to put his picks through. So I don't know. This is going to be one of those things we're going to have to see. Ted, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamal.
Ted Rawl is political cartoonist, syndicated columnist, and co-host of Too Much Information with the one and only Manila Chan. I want to bring in my next guest. I'm super glad he could join me, especially considering it was someone at the last minute when I hit him last night. Robert Fatina. He is author, journalist, and activist working for peace and social justice. He is also author of the book Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. Man, thank you for joining me, Robert. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Better that you are with me. The reason why I brought you on, because I was watching all of these events that were taking place in Israel. And one of the events had to do with Netanyahu in a criminal case. And what's fascinating about this is Netanyahu effectively asked, politely, I would imagine, Shin Bet to blow off his case, or at the very least postpone his case for several months, because he didn't necessarily want to testify on December 2nd in the corruption hearing. Well, they told him to kick rocks. He didn't necessarily like that all that much. And apparently there is a feeling that he wants to get rid of the head of Shin Bet because the head of Shin Bet is not giving him the excuse necessary for him to avoid that trial. Can you explain what's going on with this? Give us some details on this. For one, what is he on trial for? Let's start there.
He's on trial for corruption and bribery. These are serious charges. He is accused of receiving gifts from everything from cigars and champagne to more extensive gifts from some U.S. Individuals in exchange for political favors. So this, of course, is bribery, is corruption, and he denies any wrongdoing, of course, but the evidence is fairly clear that he he has done this, and now it's up to the courts to decide if, in fact, he is guilty of that. He's been able to delay his trial for a period of years, actually, due to the COVID pandemic, and then the genocide in Gaza, saying he has to focus on Israel's national security.
Right.
So he can't be concerned with his trial. But now the courts have said, no, it's time. You need to go on trial. And you recall that before the Israel started its current genocidal onslaught, that he was proposing a judicial overhaul, which was bringing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis to the streets in protest. But this judicial overhaul would have enabled him to escape any charges. He would have been in control politically of the judiciary and could decide who would be charged and with what charges, and he would certainly excuse himself. But now the courts have said, no, it's time for you to go on trial. He wants to remove anyone who has made that decision, and we'll see how this plays out in the next several weeks.
What are your expectations with this? I mean, like, from my understanding, the prime minister can't necessarily be put in a cage while he's prime minister. I mean, that was part of the rationale for him to proceed and continue the war. In fact, I think there are two reasons. I think one, I think people are right that there's a political, need for him to stay in power, to stay in office, to try to avoid trial. I mean, part of his argument was, well, hey, I'm in the middle of a genocide. I can't take time off the genocide and go into trial. So there was that. The other part of it, I think it's this kind of seeing himself in historical terms. This idea of I'm creating greater Israel, and in 50 years they're going to look back and they're going to remember my name for creating greater Israel, using October 7th as a basis and a premise for it. But I do agree that part of this rationale is also, if I get out of office, I'm going to be prosecuted. And so I need to stay in office by hook or by crook. So any deal that come up, I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to have the U.S. to basically back me up diplomatically and politically, so I don't have to worry about any ceasefires, and I can keep this going. I guess my thing is, what is your take on this? Can a prime minister be prosecuted? I guess that's the first question.
Well, obviously he can be prosecuted because he is, according to Israeli law. He's up against charges and he has to face them. Whether or not he can be incarcerated upon conviction is another issue. But since he was very unpopular prior to the starting the October 7th genocide. He was, as I mentioned, the public was very much opposed to judicial overhaul. But at the present time, he is experiencing increased popularity because people in Israel are happy to see Palestinians being slaughtered. As you mentioned, it is sick. But he wants to be remembered as the person who has created the greater Israel, eliminated Palestine from the map, and that's what he is in the process of doing. And he's been doing it. Israel's been doing it for years with encroachments on the West Bank through the illegal settlements. But now he has the opportunity to slaughter or drive out all the Palestinians in Gaza, reoccupy Gaza, and then annex it. So this is the legacy he wants. So the truth, he wants his legacy, as you mentioned, and he wants to stay out of prison, because even if he's convicted and can't be incarcerated during his administration, at some point there are going to be elections again. He's going to lose, and then he'll have to face justice.
Yeah, that's the sick part, right? That this is one of those things where the public actually agrees. I mean, you basically have a fascist state that says, yes, we approve of this. We don't like the judicial overhaul, but the killing of all of these Palestinians, that we do appreciate. There's a video clip where they spend about 5 minutes going through Gaza to show the level of destruction that's there. And it's becoming clear at this point that A, they want to take the north of Gaza, meaning they want to just steal it, annex it, and occupy it. But they also want to annex the West Bank. And I would argue that was obvious going back several months based upon what they were doing, meaning they were leveling areas, they were taking territory, and they were using settlers as almost the tip of a spear to kill, maim, beat, and harass the people that were there. Seymour Hersh came out with this article in his Substack, and he effectively pointed out that Israel is trying to annex and will annex the West Bank, and will do so His timeline said 2 weeks. Now, I don't necessarily know if this timeline is exactly accurate, but either way, it does follow with what they have been doing militarily almost as a policy. I mean, if you think about it, the starvation, the blowing up hospitals, the destroying infrastructure, well, you do that if you don't want people to be able to go back to a location where it's either to exterminate or expel. Same thing in West Bank, and for that matter, same thing in southern Lebanon, where they have been trying to basically exterminate the South, be able to take the South and occupy the South. Up to this point, Hezbollah has been fighting them, and they haven't necessarily been able to make a huge amount of progress. But give me your take on the taking of the West Bank. I mean, is this purely because Trump is coming into office, or they would have done this either way? Biden would have also accepted them doing this.
I think they would have done it either way. That although Trump, who approved their illegal annexation of the Golan Heights when he was president previously, has certainly given them a green light to proceed. But Israel has been slowly annexing the West Bank for decades. There are something like 800,000 illegal settlers living on Palestinian property, and Netanyahu has said not one of them will ever be required to leave. So that is de facto annexation. So the fact that he has, Biden has not been supportive at all of the Palestinians, but Trump has given Israel a complete green light to do whatever he wants.
Right.
So we're going to see, I think, whether it's the next 2 weeks or beyond that point, we're going to see Israel declare that that they're annexing the West Bank. One of his cabinet ministers said 2025 will be the year that the entirety of Palestine will be annexed. Now, Biden had an opportunity just yesterday in the United Nations Security Council to support a resolution ending a ceasefire, which would have showed some opposition to what Israel is doing. But instead, the United States vetoed that resolution. 14-1 was the vote.
Just to show this, I have the clip of it, and I want you to respond to, usually it's Linda Greenfield sitting there embarrassing America. This time around, it's this gentleman, and I want you to respond to what he's saying here. I find this to be utterly and completely detached from reality, and it bugs the hell out of me because of how detached from reality it is. This is the UN Security Council, the U.S. being the only country to vote against the resolution to end the war.
The United States also, over the course of the past year, has done more than any other country to take tangible steps to improve the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, even as the situation remains dire. We have also done more than anyone to work with the government of Israel in an effort to minimize civilian harm over the course of the conflict. The United States.
Is that true? Have we really done more than anyone to minimize harm and civilian casualties in this conflict? And keep in mind, he's saying that as he is voting against the ceasefire.
Additionally to that, the United States has sent hundreds of millions of dollars worth of additional weaponry to Israel since the genocide started. Now, the U.S. sends about $4 billion in weaponry and other aid to Israel every year. That was greatly increased since the genocide. It's been increased in weaponry. So these are weapons that are blowing people to bits. There are casualties in Palestine whose bodies will never be recovered because they've been blown apart. The United States has asked Israel to allow more humanitarian aid in, but has done nothing to actually bring that aid in.
Right.
Several months ago, the U.S. built that dock to bring aid in, and what that was used for basically was an Israeli attack on Palestinians in that part of Gaza, and then of course the dock was dismantled. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent on that just to give Israel a launch pad for one of its attacks. The United States has done nothing to help the people of Palestine when it could have ended this genocide at any point in the last 13 months, simply by telling Israel no more money at all, no more diplomatic cover in the United Nations or anywhere else. You've got to stop this now. But instead, it has protected protected Israel in the United Nations with using its veto power, and has sent hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons to Israel to slaughter the people of Palestine in Gaza. So what the UN representative, United States representative to the UN, was saying was like atrocious and just lies of monstrous proportions. How he could say those with a straight face and expect anyone to believe what he has said is beyond me.
Yeah, it's astonishing. This is Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard to wrap your head around this level of destruction. Like there is nothing to go back to in this situation. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Gaza.
And over 2 million people live there. Their lives, every single person in the Gaza Strip, all 2 million plus, their lives have been completely uprooted, completely destroyed. The death toll, the official death toll is about 44,000. That doesn't include at least 10,000 that are still buried under rubble. And the Lancet, the medical journal, has said that the more accurate total is probably 180,000. This is genocide. The United Nations has said it's genocide. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, many social organizations, human rights organizations have said this is genocide. The United States denies it. Amnesty International spokesperson said, how is it that we, Amnesty International, have information the United States doesn't have that we can identify as genocide? So the hypocrisy that the United States shows in the United Nations and everywhere else is on full display.
It's not just hypocrisy, it's just outright lying. I mean, we are ignoring our own laws in this process. Like, it's maddening that this is taking place. And one of the other questions I have, if indeed they go with this notion of annexing the area, what happens to the residents of the area? Because the wild part about it, if you have a conversation with Israel, and they would say, well, we don't want a two-state solution. We don't want to live near these animals, these people. Okay. But then if you say, okay, well, one-state solution, they would say, well, that's not Israel anymore. And so it becomes, okay, well, what do you want? Like, what is a viable option that you're willing to accept in order to get past this particular thing? It sounds like the option they've accepted is extermination. Now, if they annex the West Bank, where do the people who are living in the West Bank currently go? And it's the same question for Gaza. If they annex elements of Gaza, where do those people go? Israel doesn't necessarily want them living in a greater Israel, especially from the standpoint of one man, one vote. Wouldn't this be almost by definition an apartheid state in the way that they would have to operate it, not just kind of de facto, but in earnest? Because otherwise, I don't know how you have this kind of restraint, this group of people living in your country that don't have the same rights that you do and still call yourself a democracy, especially in areas.
The United States, Israel proclaimed that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's just political theater. That's all it is. It's just words that have no meaning. If the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are annexed, the Palestinians that are still alive in those areas will be second-class citizens in Israel. They will be subject to different laws, to different restrictions. They will not be able to, as it is in the West Bank now, they're not able to drive their cars the same roads.
Right.
And the conditions they live in are very poor. That's what it will be until such time that they are either exterminated by the settlers, which, as you mentioned before, is happening in the West Bank now, or they are driven out. They're able to be accepted by other countries. But that's another issue. Like Egypt has said, it is not going to allow large numbers of Palestinians temporary residence because they know that it will not be temporary. So this is these are dire situations for the Palestinian people, and the world is letting it happen, and the United States is financing it happening. And under a Trump administration, things are only going to get worse, hard as it may be to imagine, for the people of Palestine.
I don't know how it would get worse. I mean, the reality of it is Joe Biden has given a blank check to any and everything Netanyahu has wanted. And he's grumbled every so often behind the scenes. But I got to be honest, I don't think the grumbling is legitimate. The grumbling is just kind of to appease a base. And the problem is, if you grumble for a year, nobody takes you seriously. And so it just became extraordinarily clear that whether it's the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail, the policy remains, meaning there's a real world physical matter reality that people are living through as a result of us paying over 70% for this war, meaning the rivers of blood that we're swimming through, we paid for the overwhelming majority of it. It is impossible for it to persist without either our money, our weapon systems, or for that matter, the political and diplomatic support that we use in the UN Security Council. I mean, if you remember, when the UN Security Council passed the resolution for a ceasefire, the US came out and effectively undercut the UN Security Council, said, well, this is a non-binding resolution. But it doesn't matter. And people were like, well, the UN Security Council don't have non-binding resolutions. It's the Security Council. The US fundamentally undermined the UN Security Council in order to protect Israel with diplomatic cover. It's just astonishing. I have a question for you about inside Israel, though. I mean, I think the US is going with the idea that Israel is winning. And in alternative media, there's this argument that they are not winning, and not just not winning. They're still bogged down in Gaza. They're still fighting in the West Bank. They're still fighting in southern Lebanon and taking losses in southern Lebanon, significant losses, to the degree where there's a manpower shortage. Apparently 40% of the reservists either don't want to show up or don't show up. They've gotten to the point of trying to bring in the ultra-Orthodox. That is not going well at all, considering that this is part of Netanyahu's base. This is not something he wants, and they don't want to join a fight anyway. The economy has hit the skids, because if you think about it, Palestinians were working in those places. Well, that stopped. The Israeli soldiers that were working in those places, well, though they're soldiers there on the front lines, you have millions of people, or a million people, that are fundamentally left because they don't think it's safe anymore. And Netanyahu's war goal was, we want our people to be able to go back to the north, which there is no chance anytime soon of that happening. So if that is Israel right now, are they winning this? Like, how do you view this? Like, what is going on in Israel itself?
Well, within Israel itself, as you mentioned, there's chaos. The people of Israel know that they can't sleep peacefully at night. They don't know what's going to happen from as far as any kind of attack from Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, or Iran, and who knows who else might get involved.
Right.
So the people they know they're not safe there. That shouldn't give them confidence in what the government is doing. The military is taking losses despite its power and the backing of the United States. Morale is low, and the thing you mentioned that is most important to the Israeli government is the economy. They don't want their economy to be damaged, although it has been, because like the U.S. government leaders in Israel are only interested in power and profits. But and this is so. What Israel has is a trump card, if I could put that. The United States will always bail it out financially, militarily, diplomatically, and with Trump coming into office, that's going to accelerate. So while the country, Israel, isn't winning, in fact, Israel's military leaders have said they've accomplished all they can accomplish in Gaza. There's no reason for them to be there in Gaza. They need to withdraw. But the political leaders are saying, no, we need to stay there. Right. Their goal to eliminate Hamas, which is that's like saying we're going to eliminate Republicans. Hamas is a political party, and it's an ideology. It's not going to be eliminated. But they're continuing despite what the military is telling them. In Lebanon, the political leaders in Israel have said they're going to use the same model they used in Gaza, which is massive destruction. But Lebanon isn't Gaza, despite the fact that Israel has destroyed some of Lebanon's military. There's still a lot left, and Lebanon has powerful allies that Israel doesn't really want to provoke, such as Iran. Now, there has been back and forth bombing between Israel and Iran, but it hasn't become any full-fledged war yet. The United States is probably doing something to restrain Israel in that regard, because a war against Iran would not be limited only to the Middle East. It would bring in Russia and China in all likelihood, and would just erupt around the world. So even the warmongering U.S. government leaders don't want to risk that. However, Israel might push them to it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because that goes into the conversation with Trump and the level of complication that Trump is about to come into. The first time around, Trump was able to have a policy of isolation from the standpoint of Iran and from the standpoint of North Korea. Not North Korea, I'm sorry. Let's stick with Iran, from the standpoint of Iran. In isolating Iran in that particular way, he was able to come up with the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia was on board. They were willing to ignore Palestine altogether and just kind of join hands with Israel on this while isolating Iran into the mix. That is not our world today. And Saudi Arabia is arm in arm with Iran. I mean, they just put out a statement effectively calling each other brothers, saying, we have no want for anybody to attack our brother. And Iran came up with the same thing. Basically, Sunni and Shia has been brought together with each group saying the other is my brother. All right. On top of that, you have the situation with Iran being part of BRICS and being very close to China and Russia. Militarily with Russia, because they're going to have a security pact. And with China, China gets 90% of Iran's oil. So this is not the world that Donald Trump left. Not to mention Israel in this particular context is a pariah state all across the world. So how does Trump engage in any kind of pressure campaign against Iran in an environment where Iran is not isolated and not alone? I don't know what that looks like. It just looks like chaos to me if he even tries.
It would be chaotic, but Donald Trump himself has demonstrated very little understanding of world politics and diplomacy and the kinds of alliances and associations between countries that are ever changing and certainly changed significantly since he was last in office. The cabinet he's assembling, which is just it would be I'd call it would be a circus, but there's nothing humorous about it or entertaining.
Yeah.
But they also see things in terms of black and white. Iran is bad, Russia's bad, Ukraine is good, Israel's good, Palestine's bad. No nuances anywhere, no understanding. If they would look at it, China brokered the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran just a couple of years ago. So that completely bypassed any U.S. diplomacy. It eased tensions in the Middle East, which is not in the U.S.'s interest, apparently.
Right.
So what Trump's going to do? He says he wants to drain the swamp and shake things up. He's going to shake things up, but it's going to be to the detriment of not only people in the Middle East and around the world, but in the United States as well. This any aggression towards Iran is going to erupt horrifically. We were talking about the Israeli economy, and one of the things that is to be mentioned is the shipping routes that have been disrupted mainly by Yemen. What's going to happen to shipping through the Middle East and through the Persian Gulf and so on if the United States starts aggressively attacking Iran? What's that going to do to availability of oil in other parts of the world, the price of oil, and so on? It's going to be you use the word chaos, and chaos is the right word, and it's Trump doesn't understand the situations. He has no interest in understanding them. He just wants what he feels his base thinks will support. He'll do it. So we're going to see him. I think he's going to approve any annexation of Palestine, which will bring a tremendous amount of opposition from the world community. He may decide to either attack Iran or encourage Israel to do so. This is not going to be a conventional war. This is going to be, Iran is close to having a nuclear weapon. Whether it's trying to get one or not, we don't know. But if it does, and Israel attacks, Israel, of course, is a nuclear armed nation. There's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. If a nuclear war happens, it's going to be disastrous for the world. And with Donald Trump having nuclear codes, this is not bode well.
Do you put any validity into the reports that came out that says Elon Musk was meeting behind the scenes with Iran?
Um, Elon Musk has his hands everywhere, and because he's so wealthy, he can go into a number of areas. What he would be doing talking to Iran is I can't even imagine why Iran would want to talk to him or what he would propose to Iran. Now, Iran is more open. So they may say, well, this is a future U.S. government official wants to talk to us. Let's meet with him, see what he has to say.
Right.
But
Well,
who knows?
Trump can do it behind the scenes. I mean, Elon can do it behind the scenes, meaning he's low level enough, but high level enough where it can be a kind of back channel communication, especially if Trump, somebody posed me, I think it was John Kiriakou, that it took Nixon to go to China. Oftentimes it takes a certain level of political credibility of being against something that allows you to reach across the aisle to be for something. So Bill Clinton, for example, can do NAFTA. Bill Clinton can get rid of welfare because those were Republican priorities. A Democrat was doing it. And so the Democrat was somewhat spared the ire that would typically be leveled at Republicans for that. Same thing with Nixon. He is a hardliner. And so the hardliner can make that trip in order to make a deal. Do you see anything like that with Trump? If indeed Trump comes in saying, I want to end wars, not start wars, and he does this thing of putting people like Gabbard, RFK, who are at the very least against wars when they're not against Arabs, and put these other hardliners in office, and yet sends Musk behind the scenes to have a conversation saying, hey, we want to bring this to some kind of resolution. Do you see that at all? I'm curious. Maybe I'm reaching, but
I think the examples you've given of Nixon in China, for example, no Democrat could have done that because they would be called soft on communism, all this other stuff. But he was able to do it.
Exactly.
If Musk is going to Iran on behalf of Trump, it's only going to be to threaten Iran, to say leave Israel alone, or we're going to carpet bomb Iran. It wouldn't be. Trump would not be. It's not his personality to say, we have some things you want, you have some things we want. Where can we meet in the middle? That's not Trump's style. Might makes right. He's going to be the head of the most powerful country in the world, and he's going to throw that power around. So if Musk is going to Iran, it's to issue threats and warnings, not for diplomatic purposes.
But I don't see how Iran is not a weak actor in this. That's what I mean. It's not a country that's isolated in this situation. For one, Israel has pissed off everybody. And the Arab states might not necessarily be attacking, but clearly the populations in those states are inflamed. Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, Russia, India, all of these countries are under the auspices of BRICS. And it's possible that if Donald Trump goes in and attacks Iran, Russia and Iran has a security agreement. So whatever deal Trump may make to get the United States out of this kind of thicket in Ukraine and to be, let's say, more, to bring down hostilities with Russia, attacks on Iran are going to immediately increase those hostilities, not just with Russia, but also with China. I got to be honest, I am deeply concerned about the Middle East with Donald Trump in office. For whatever potential of lessening hostilities with Russia, I get the sense that they're going to be elevated on the other end with China and Iran. It's like there's no way out. I mean, I could be wrong. Oh, before I let you go, one last question. How do you think this ends? Meaning, what do you think this looks like in the very end? Because there's no way Israel can say it's safer than it was on October 6th. And not just not safer than it was on October 6th. It is in a treacherous, dangerous world of its own making at this point. And if indeed they decide, okay, we're going to take the West Bank and we're going to take parts of Gaza. Okay, there are people that live there. So what, from your point of view, does this end up looking like when it finally comes to some resolution, some ceasefire, some endpoint? Because I don't get the sense that we can go back to a same old, same old. I don't think Israel can kill 40,000 children and then say, okay, we're going to go back to the status quo. I don't think there is a status quo from here on out. But give me your thoughts on this. And this will be the last one.
I agree. It can't go back the way it was. The world is seeing Israel very differently than it saw it a year ago. It's seeing it for its crimes. What the worst case scenario is that that Israel annexes the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians living there are second-class citizens under tremendous oppression. But the resistance has always been strong in Palestine, and annexation isn't going to end that. They will continue to resist. The people, Israelis, will continue to be unsafe in their homes, and the world community will continue to advocate for Palestine, even if their governments don't. We've seen millions and millions of people marching in major cities around the world repeatedly in support of the Palestinians. These are people who are concerned with human rights and international law. They're not so much concerned with power and profits. So this isn't going to end anytime soon unless, and this would be a miracle, there's a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders, and just as those borders might be, that's a topic for another discussion.
I mean, I guess I'm sorry, I'm shaking my head because it's a unicorn. I mean, up to this point, it's been used as a fig leaf in order to justify further expansion. Hey, we're going to get the two-state solution, and they continue to still expropriate more land. Oh, we're going to work towards the two-state, and continue to expropriate more land. It's almost like the negotiations this time around were used to allow killing.
And negotiation, the United States is always saying two-state solution based on negotiations. Negotiations can only occur when each party has something the other wants that can only get by surrendering something it has. Israel takes whatever it wants from Palestine with complete impunity, so why would it negotiate? It says, I want this, I want your natural resources. Palestine says, no, you can't have them. Israel says, take them anyway. And the United States says, that's okay. So it can be no negotiations. International law is what must be adhered to.
There is no such thing as international law.
Unfortunately. Of course, Netanyahu has just, arrest warrant has just been issued for Netanyahu. That's big.
It is. No, I agree, but the United States has stopped the Hague Act. And that is for our own soldiers, but it's also for soldiers of allies, which means if in some weird situation that Netanyahu is locked up, and I agree with you, this is deeply humiliating for Netanyahu. We will use our military to attack the Hague in order to let him out of prison. Like, that is mind-blowing to think that we even passed a law like that. And, you know, it's like we will attack the International Criminal Court, which just sounds horrendous.
It is horrendous.
But Robert, I have to let you go. Man, thank you for this. I really appreciate this. And I definitely want to have you back. I appreciate your analysis on this. I was just curious on, you know, what was taking place in Israel, and I wanted to get more details and more context for it. And you did a great job in doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to another visit.
Absolutely. Robert Fatina. He is an author, journalist, and activist working for peace and social justice. He is author of the new book, Settler Colonialism in Palestine and in Kashmir. Man, thank you for this. All right. I want to bring in my next guest, the one and only good friend of the show, KJ. No, he is our expert on China and Asia in general, and he has been our expert for a very long time. He knows this stuff. KJ No, journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, thank you for joining me, man. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Pleasure to be with you.
Good morning for you. That's not right. No, man, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. There was a report that came out. In fact, there were two reports. One about a meeting that was basically rebuffed by Lloyd Austin. But the one that really piqued my interest was Europe trying to steal technology from China, this technology theft, as the United States call it. Now, what I'm talking about, and I'm being somewhat facetious on this, is that the United States, okay, let me start at the beginning. When companies went to China, one of the things that China said was, look, we don't, and KJ, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. China said, look, you are going to benefit magnificently by using our labor pool, our workforce. You're going to get massively rich because you're going to be able to take jobs where you're paying people $20 an hour in your country, pay them $5 an hour here, and reap the benefits of the profits. However, we require technology transfers, meaning we require something out this deal also, as opposed to you just getting our manpower. We need to grow and develop as a country. You have the technology to do so. We have the manpower to help you get rich. Win-win relationship. Let's do it. And that's what they did. The US, when they realized, oh my God, the horse is out the barn, China is no longer, during the period of humiliation. This is a different China. They're growing. They've pulled 200 million people out of poverty. We now have an issue. We have a competitor. And so China, they started to say, China is stealing technology. They are stealing our technology. Europe has just come out, what they were talking about were tech transfers. Europe has just come out with this. And I saw this and was like, oh my God, how times have changed. EU to demand technology transfers from China or Chinese companies. New requirements would apply to batteries, but could be expanded to other green sectors. So they want to A, pass sanctions on China because they can't compete, but B, on top of it, get the technology that allows China to either mass produce or to create the products that they create to help them compete. Isn't that astonishing? 50 years ago or 20 years ago, they would have been screaming that China was stealing technology. Now they're trying to use the same method to get to boost their own economies. Give me your take on that, KJ. And for one, did I explain that correctly? And two,
Yes.
give me your take on it.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And it's pretty astonishing. It's a complete turning of the tables, a complete reversal of the narrative, if you will, because for decades, not only the US, but the EU was shrieking from the rooftops that the Chinese were completely unoriginal. The only thing that they did that allowed them to get ahead was that they were stealing Western technology. They're incapable of innovation, incapable of creating anything original or, innovative.
Yeah.
And now they're making the demand of China that you have to turn over your technology as a condition for setting up corporations in our country, because they have made it impossible for China, or they're planning to make it impossible for China to export products directly because they're erecting sanctions barriers like the United States. So the hypocrisy of that is over the charts. But more than that, by making this demand, by making this claim, they're throwing out free trade out the window, which they claim is a universal good, which all countries should, adhere to. And secondly, they've completely demolished their mythology that China is incapable of innovating, that China stole their way to the top. Now they're demanding, by their terms, by their framing, to steal Chinese technology.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, and on some level, it indicates, I got to be honest, I'm fascinated by this. I feel like we're living in a transition of sorts, that this kind of world is going from this unipolar moment into this kind of multipolar environment. And there are different rule sets for these different environments. And in one rule set, the US sets the rules as they go. It can undermine the UN Security Council. It can say, we're for free trade up until the point where it hurts us, in which case we're now going into protectivism. And I'm including all of the West with this, not just the United States. And now we're moving into this thing where the overwhelming majority of the world either wants to be in BRICS or is either aligned with BRICS in some way. I mean, or the 6% of the world population. Those countries have aligned in a way where they've said, we want to trade with each other in our own currencies, meaning we want to stop the use of the dollar, which is part of the hegemonic control that's exerted by the US, or means a force carrier of sorts, if you want to call it. We don't want to sanction one another. We want to deal with each other on peaceful terms. We want a win-win relationships. Okay, well, this is different than this idea of Europe and the U.S. setting the rules of the road as they go forward. I feel like we're in a sea change. Do you see it that way? I mean, especially, I would say Ukraine is a canary in the coal mine. NATO didn't have the power, whether it was financial or, for that matter, military, in order to affect their will on the ground. I would say Syria is another one. They weren't able to kick over the Syrian government in the way they were able to do Libya and Iraq. And I would say this is another one where, in a technological standpoint, Europe is being deindustrialized. They admitted that they were being deindustrialized and they were falling behind the rest of the globe. And now they're looking to China, a country that they derided, that they consider themselves better than and morally superior to. And like you said, technologically more proficient than. And now they're in a situation where they're like, hey, we need to be able to get our hands on your technology. I guess I'm pointing out that is a 180 over the course of 20, 30 years. That is pretty profound. I know it seems like a long time, but 30 years in the span of history is a drop in the bucket. It's a blink of an eye.
Yeah, absolutely correct. 30 years is a blink of an eye, and it really shows that, the world has changed. We are no longer in Kansas anymore. It's 180 degrees. The first thing is that, yes, you're absolutely correct. The Europeans believed that not only were they morally superior to the Chinese, but they believed that they were intellectually superior to the Chinese. This is racism that goes back hundreds of years to Herder, to Goethe, even to Marx. You can see these beliefs. And now they are in the position where they have to coerce and, let's name it, beg the Chinese for their technology. Because, let's be very clear about this, the Chinese are the overwhelming innovators and leaders of green technology. They're literally greening not only their country, but the global south. They're doing incredible things that are transforming the planet. I mean, just recently they released, a blueprint, a model for, a mini portable solar-powered desalination device that will essentially change. It will change the nature of water production around the world. So they're just incredible things that the Chinese are doing, and the Europeans, they're aware now of this, and they're demanding that China surrender its technology to Europe under coercive conditions, that is, under threat of sanctions. But I think it really does point to the fact that, this is the sea change that is happening. This is the transition to the multipolar world. And this is why the US and the West is throwing up protectionist barriers. It's returning to neo-mercantilism, because global free trade was really just a myth. It was only convenient when it was advantageous to them. Here's one more symbol or signal of this shift to a multipolar world, is that China is now issuing bonds, Chinese bonds, denominated in US dollars in Saudi Arabia at the same rates of the US Treasury.
Wait, you lost me on this. Because I saw something about this. I didn't read into the story, and so I didn't fully understand what it was. So I'm glad you brought this up to explain it. How are they issuing US bonds in Saudi Arabia with dollars as opposed to yuan, which is their currency? How is this? Explain how this works.
Well, I mean, a country can issue bonds in any currency, in any denomination they want to. They just have to be able to pay those back. And China has a surplus of dollars, so it could issue bonds in any currency. Of course, it could issue them in yuan, but it is issuing them in dollars. And when the country wants dollars, it will reclaim the bond, give them dollars. China has a surplus of dollars. But the key thing to note here is that it's issuing bonds at the same rates as the US Treasury, which means that the US It means that it considers its bonds as good as US treasuries. And secondly, it's issuing them in Saudi Arabia, which is an extraordinary symbolic statement because Saudi Arabia is the center of the origination of the petrodollar. Essentially, what this is doing is it's undermining the US dollar hegemony in ways that the US has never even conceived of as possible. Of course, there's a move to de-dollarization among all the BRICS countries. They're no longer using the dollar for transactions between themselves. They're simply exchanging their own currencies by using, coordinated clearinghouses and ledgers. So that's one movement towards de-dollarization. But the Chinese are also showing, and this is, like out of left field, it's a knight's move, if you will, that they can also issue debt in, not simply debt in their currency, but debt in US dollars. And the US has no control over this. They can essentially increase dollar debt according to their desires. They can reduce it at will. And if the US sanctions those countries, that will push further into de-dollarization. Or it can try and match Chinese rates, or it can reduce their, increase their rates, which will then have, effects on their own economy. So
But that's what. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue.
no, I mean, it shows that the Chinese have tremendous economic and financial power, that the US is not the sole, guarantor and holder of the world's financial system anymore.
I mean, man, that's an understatement. I mean, it goes so much further. You said it's a knight's move, and I was thinking, at the moment you said, I was thinking Petrosian. Petrosian is this famous chess player, and his claim to fame was that he was slow, methodical, strategic, and he wasn't one of those players that were flashy. Like, he wasn't the guy who would sack this piece, sack that piece, and then mate with something. He was the guy who would squeeze you to death. Like, his gameplay would get the person to the point where there were just no good moves for the person. It was just that way, this kind of Python-like grip of chess. If you think about it, the Thucydides' trap, on some level, that's being played, it is being played using peace as a weapon, but it's also being played in the context of economic and military sphere. And in the economic sense, in a way that I hadn't really thought about it, China, if it's appropriating dollars and it's matching what it is in the currency, then it's effectively competing with our treasury for the issuance of debt. I mean, for the issuance of the dollars. So there's that part. Then there's de-dollarization stuff going on simultaneously with this. So it comes across as almost as if they are dumping dollars on one end while simultaneously avoiding using them on the other end. And the more countries that get involved in this, the fewer countries using the dollar. So that 50 whatever percentage rate of countries that use the dollar as a reserve currency would inevitably go down. I didn't even think about it in those terms. Wow. I didn't even think they could do that, but you're right. China is one of the main people who have bought up our bonds, correctly? Like, they have hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yes, probably $800-900 billion worth. And, they can essentially, it's their way of getting rid of those. And it's also a way of hijacking, if you will, US control over its dollar hegemony. So it really is a Petrosian move. It's, from this moment, everything that the US is going to do in that particular instance is a zugzwang. There are no good moves.
Yeah. Wow. That is fascinating. I mean, that is utterly fascinating. I mean, it really is. I got into this conversation with Glenn Deason. And in the conversation, John Mearsheimer had made this point about this kind of fight for survival, and that it wasn't really any participant's fault in that fight for survival, that all of the countries are just fighting for supremacy because they want to ensure security. And if I am in charge, then by definition, I am secure. That's kind of the logic, or the extension of the logic. And going with this notion of realist logic, that fight is natural. And because that fight is natural, that what countries do in pursuant to that fight, you can't really blame the countries. You have to blame the situation to which the countries are in. I fundamentally disagree with that. And part of the reason that I was in the conversation with Glenn Deason that I disagree with it is because these things are choices. Like, nobody is forcing a country to make that choice. A country could very well choose win-win relationships. They could choose, well, hey, I don't want to fight you. I think my chances are better, and I think my lot is better. I think our lot is better if we work together as opposed to trying to kill each other in a fight for supremacy. That is every bit as natural as me trying to, off you in order to take what you have and take that particular pole position. What is your thought on that? And to be fair, Mearsheimer even admitted that if the unipolar moment occurred with China instead of the US, that China wouldn't have been as interventionist as the US just because they had a different philosophy in the way that they operated. So from my point of view, that on some level undercuts his original argument that the somewhat is a natural process. What is your take on that, though? I mean, do you consider this fight for supremacy necessarily, imposed by the logic of events, meaning it's just a natural state of being for people to fight for that level of supremacy? Or do you also agree with me on this stuff, that this stuff is a choice? How do you see this? Because that's going to, on some level, determine how international relation continues and whether or not we can reach, and it is possible to reach a new norm where we work together and cooperate as a norm, as opposed to lawlessness and the law of the jungle. Give me your thoughts on this.
I believe it is completely possible to cooperate and coordinate and work together with dialogue rather than to compete and enter into what the neo-realists call the security dilemma, which is that I say that I'm increasing my security, but what that does is that threatens you, and then you increase yours, and then pretty soon we're in an escalatory spiral, which eventually will lead to some kind of conflict. Now, there's a cardinal error within Mearsheimer's thinking, and essentially this, the neo-realist position is that the world is anarchic. There is no overarching authority to rule the world, and therefore countries seek their own self-interest, and at the same time they can never be sure of the intentions of other countries. They can never be sure. There's an epistemic blindness at the heart of international relations, which means that in order to preserve your own security, you have to take either defensive or offensive measures. And so this is the heart of the neo-realist dilemma. But the thing that underlines it is this notion of win-lose rather than win-win.
Exactly.
That your gain is my loss and vice versa. And secondly, the other belief, which is very core in Western philosophy, is this notion of epistemic blindness. It means that I cannot know what you are thinking. It literally boils down to this Western philosophical position that we can never read other minds. We cannot know or be sure of other minds. We can't even know if they exist, but certainly we cannot know what they're thinking or desiring. And that is the foundation of capitalist individualism. We cannot know each other. All we can do is seek our own self-interest. Therefore, we meet either in the market or elsewhere to maximize our own profit, our own interest. That belief is fundamentally wrong because human beings communicate with each other. They get to know each other. They understand each other. And based on that communication, that intersubjectivity, they can find meaningful accord, concord, and cooperation. That's what's foundationally wrong with Mearsheimer's thinking. And it's essentially capitalist narcissism writ large, projected onto international relations, which is why Mearsheimer is giving bad advice.
Well, to be fair to Mearsheimer, though, I mean, that is the way Western culture has gone back. Like if you go back to Napoleon, for example, and you look at Napoleonic Wars, even before Napoleon, they still had that same practice of the world as a geopolitical chessboard. And if I'm stronger, you'll be my vassal. And when you're stronger, I'll be your vassal. And every so often we have wars to fight for determination about who's going to be the strongest, a test of strength. And for what, 400, 500 years? You just said that. And so the United States comes out of that very same tradition. It's the way we deal. That's why we don't have equals. We have vassals or we have enemies. And we operate in a very similar context. And I think your point, and I agree with your point. In fact, I will go further. The entire premise that we don't do that in our typical relations, because countries, let's be honest, is really just an expansion of the human being. Like when they even say intelligence, okay, well, from a human standpoint, what we know, well, we call it intelligence in the context of a country in regards to intel, what we can see, all of those things, like we have allegories for those things in the context of countries. And in the same way that I don't know what you're thinking, meaning as a flat fact, I don't even know that you exist, but I have to accept that you do. I have to accept what you say is either true or false, and I can evaluate that and come to some kind of conclusion about your trustworthiness and so forth. Okay, well, countries are put in the exact same situations. It's the reason why any country can interact and work with any other country, and other countries do work with one another, which kind of leads to the point that, yes, it is possible for countries to coincide, work with, and organize together in order to build larger structures. We do it as human beings on a daily basis, even though people are blank slates. When we are engaging them, we don't know what the ghost in the machine is thinking or doing, or if there's a ghost in the machine at all. And yet we function in organizations. And it takes cooperation to build anything bigger. So I agree with you on this. I would have heard him say that. I kept thinking, but those are choices. Like, if you want to say violence is natural, fair enough. So is cooperation. And each of those things can be chosen as a modus operandi, not just on an individual level from us as human beings, but also from the standpoint of what the countries believe in and what the countries reach for. At least that's my take.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Jamal. And let's reduce it to its simplest terms. Think about relations. You know, for example, let's say you have a partner. You have the choice to seek a modus vivendi, if you will, where you communicate, you listen, you intuit, you have connection, and that gives you awareness, and you work together. Or you can reduce it to we are simple individuals, we are separate from each other, and therefore, essentially, we have a relationship of domination and control. And there are people who fall all along the spectrum. There are relationships that are all about control and domination. And then there are relationships which are all about communication and understanding. And you have to make a decision, but you have to understand that it's not just one thing, and that it's possible for both individuals and countries to work on communication and understanding in order to build a mutual future together. This is what the multipolar world is proposing, and it's exactly what the unipolar world is opposed to, because it has always had, as you point out, at least since the colonial period, a relationship of domination, control, extraction, and exploitation towards the global south. That is what's shifting, changing right now, and that's what the unipolar world will not tolerate, does not want.
No, it's an amazing point. I mean, it's effectively holding that promise up. Now, whether they can accomplish that promise or not, who knows? But that is the promise that they're effectively holding out to many of the other countries in the global south, for the matter of Africa or South America, et cetera. Basically, poorer, weaker countries can see that and think to themselves, okay, do I want to be in a situation of domination, or do I want to be in a situation of cooperation? And what I'm hoping is what they realize is, hey, cooperation is better. Like, that's what I'm hoping the world gets to. And I'm hoping that the United States at some point join in with that frame of reference. I can't see it anytime soon.
This is how the human species developed. This is how it evolved. We evolved from hierarchical primates into cooperative hunter-gatherer bands. This is the direction of human evolution. This is why we have language. This is why we have humor. This is why we support the underdog. This is why we take down, people who are, this is why all the tabloids take down people who think they're too big for their britches.
By the way, it's why we have societies. Society doesn't function without cooperation.
This is why we have this show, Jamal.
Yeah. KJ, man, thank you for this. It's hopeful, philosophical on some level, very Star Trek-esque, but it is a choice. I mean, I would accept Mearsheimer as being more correct in times of stress. Like if you have a bunch of cows and you don't have much food, okay, those cows are going to get aggressive because you've created a situation of lack. There's not enough. And because there's not enough, you increase the level of competition that people are engaged in. Fair enough. But if you work towards a world with abundance, you can avoid that. Like, I guess look, I want a different world. And it seems that the rest of the world are leaving us behind on that very specific train of multipolarity. And it seems that we are trying to hold our finger in the hole. The whole, it's like we are not going to allow this to go through, because if we allow it to go through, we lose something out of it because we are in a primary position. It's almost like the very fact of losing the primary position is a loss of something intangible that we are trying to fight. KJ, thank you for this, man. KJ No is there we are, is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's a contributor on the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. By the way, KJ, is there somewhere else that people can find you? I never ask you, and I always intend to.
They can find me on the Breakthrough News Network. I do a show called Reports on I do a show called The China Report on the Breakthrough News Network, which is designed to give you new and accurate information about China. It's a way of kind of degaussing people from all the propaganda that they're exposed to. But Jamal, I'm right with you. I believe everything you said. I have that same optimism. And more than that, I believe that under stress, that is when cooperation becomes even more important. In fact, that's probably why we started cooperating. When the human species were under stress, that's when they developed mechanisms for cooperation.
Yeah, agreed. Because I think that underpins Mearsheimer's point of view is that it's natural to want to be in charge or control, or you get something out of it. But I guess my point of view is you get more out of cooperation. I mean, like you build societies with cooperation. You build, products. You build companies. Like any level of higher organization requires cooperation. Full stop. It's just, you can look at our world in the way our world is. How do you build something big? It's not one individual putting stones in order to make a pyramid. It's a bunch of people coming together, putting their thoughts and mind behind a specific point in order to do something big. I guess my sense is we can choose to be different. And I know we've had a model on this planet of not doing that. But, at one point, slavery was normal. At one point, you can put people in a coliseum and have them kill each other. We change. And I'm hoping
it was not normal. I would argue that it was an aberration. I think it was wrong. It was absolutely an aberration. And I believe, I don't want to be essentialist, but I believe that our human nature, our species being, is one of cooperation. As I said, we evolved through cooperation. I'll tell you a personal anecdote before I hold you too long.
No,
but
you're fine.
I was in the Korean military, and the military is probably the most hierarchical institution on the planet. And I was in a combat infantry division, and we were undergoing guerrilla warfare training.
Yeah.
And I was astonished that when we started our guerrilla warfare training, all of the people who had threatened, abused, and commanded you, all had their rank insignia covered up. In other words, under times of extreme stress, under
We're all
times
equal.
of guerrilla warfare, we are all equal. And I
Wow.
believe that is the fundamental human condition, that when we are under stress, when we are under extreme pressure, we band together, we come together as a human community. I think
See, I think
that,
it's both, KJ. I think
yeah,
I think both are equals. It's kind of like and I don't mean equals in a qualitative sense. I just mean equals in the sense that either can be accepted. And it could be some people who think my lot is better on my own, in which case I'm going to kill, pillage in order to get any and everything that I need in the situation. And you have other people who come together saying, no, our lot is better together. And in our lot being better together, I would argue that that person who thinks they are better off as an individual are just wrong. Like, I know they may see it, that they think they're better off in that particular way, but I think all things being equal, if they had a larger context and they could look at both outcomes and both realities, they would find that working in tandem gets them further along. I just think people could choose either. And I think both are as natural, as one is as natural as the other. I just think one has better outcomes. KJ, man, I appreciate this conversation. I'm glad to hear that somebody else, I'm not crazy on that front. That there are other people who also think that cooperation is something that people can do and that we can grow into, and that the world is trying to, at the very least, in fits and start, trying to get to. KJ, no. Thank you, man. I appreciate this. All right, guys, we have come to the end of the show. My name is Jamal Thomas. Like, share it, subscribe to it, hit the notification bell. I pop in at all times of the day and night. I got to be honest, I'm beginning to drag ass right now. I was here at 3 a.m. Doing the news. I couldn't sleep. There were a few items that I wanted to hit before going to bed, and I ended up spending, I don't know, I think I finally lay down at 4 o'clock. So I have had an all-nighter, and so you're probably not going to see me anymore for today. But we had a massive show all the way through, and we even had a situation where finally I was able to get Ritter to join me. Yeah, we had a good show. We had a damn good show today. So, like I said, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I'm going to say you can support the work through PayPal, Patreon, or for that matter, super chats or super stickers, whichever you want to call them. All stickers will be read, provided you're not sexist, racist, or bigoted. No, I am not a perfect man. Nobody is perfect. There are going to be things you disagree with me about. That is perfectly okay. This is not an echo chamber. God bless you for doing so. I would say any particular point of view that I had, I should be able to defend it. But that doesn't mean that you're going to agree with my defense. So it is what it is. But look, I want to thank all of you for joining me. I mean, my goal is to get to 40,000 by the end of the year. We are moving towards that number. We're moving strongly towards that number. Whether we can get it or not, I don't know. It's possible. But I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to be here 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. I'm going to remain consistent. And I'm going to do news, politics with the best damn morning show and the best damn morning show audience that any person could ask for. So I'm going to call it a day. You all have a fantastic day and be safe. The Jamal Thomas Morning Show signing off. Have a good one all.